My name is David Irving. You've probably read my books. That's probably why you've got this recording. I'm going to talk about my life and times and where I come from. The reason I'm making this recording is because way ahead now, I'm at an age when you can begin to see the stoplights ahead. They're beginning to turn amber, and you don't know when they're going to turn red. I've got about 3 books left to write. I've got the 3rd volume of my Churchill biography. I've got a Himmler biography I'm working on, which has taken 10 years already with some interruptions that I'm going to talk about. And I've got my own personal autobiography. So what you're hearing now is something of my own personal autobiography, where I come from, who I am, what I believe, and the books I've written, and the methods that have been used by the people I call the traditional enemies of free speech. The people who try to stop me from researching, from writing, from publishing what I find to be true, and then from distributing the books that I've published. It's been an interesting fight, and believe me, it's still going on. I was born the last son of a Royal Navy commander. He was a man who fought in the Battle of Jutland in 1916 as an ensign aboard a British battleship. And then in World War II he fought again, finally being invalided out in 1942 after making several runs with the Royal Navy escorting the Arctic convoys from Iceland to North Russia. He was a great man. He was a wonderful writer too, and I suppose perhaps something of his writing ability has percolated through into my veins as well. He wrote a book on the Battle of Jutland. He wrote another book on the First Battle of the Falkland Isles and of Coronel. He wrote the official history of the Royal Yacht, the King's Britannia, as his book is called. And finally, the very last book he ever wrote was a book on the Battle of Jutland, which he and I wrote together because he was by that time a very old man. I say he was very old, but my brother told me a few weeks ago, he said, "You know, David, Daddy died, and he's younger at a time when he was younger than either of us are now." That's something you don't really want to be told. But it's a salutary warning that you've only got a limited span of life on this mortal coil, and you've got to put it to the best use you can. Unfortunately, my writing career has been interrupted once or twice. It's interrupted twice by prison. In 1995, a German publisher had me sent to prison for 2 weeks for contempt of court in England, in Pentonville, a famous prison where they used to hang people. They hanged Dr. Crippen in Pentonville prison. And in 2005, I was ambushed in Austria when I went to lecture to university students, and I was put on trial in Austria under a law introduced by the Stalin government in 1945, a law called the Banning Law. Nothing to do with the Holocaust, as it's called. It was the Banning Law. And under the Banning Law, I was accused of having written or said things that might have been more favorable to the Nazi government than was deemed politically correct. I was put on trial in February 2006 and sentenced to 3 years in prison. And I began serving that prison sentence in the oldest prison in Austria, in Vienna. And I stayed there for 400 days in solitary confinement, in a room about 6 feet square. Imagine sitting in a room 6 feet square, probably the smallest room in your house. And I sat looking at those walls for the next 400 days, very little exercise, until finally the Austrian Court of Appeal, addressed by a very brave Austrian lawyer who himself had been repeatedly prosecuted and threatened for defending people who believed in free speech like me. The Austrian Court of Appeal ordered my immediate release. But even then, they held me in prison for another day, a different prison, a police prison, while the same judge tried to get a new charge up and running against me on the account that I had spoken to the BBC. I'd made an interview with the BBC from that prison block in Vienna in 2006. The BBC had given me a phone number to phone, and I saw that phone standing there in the prison wing. I picked up the phone and I spoke for 10 minutes to the BBC, and the BBC broadcast that interview with me, a prisoner in Vienna, over the BBC networks around the world all day long. And on account of that, a new charge was levelled against me by the judge under Section 3H of the Banning Law. Under Section 3H of the Banning Law, I could have been sentenced to 20 years in prison, or even life, because it was a repeat offence. You see, some countries believe in free speech and some countries don't. I thought we won World War II against Germany and Austria too, of course. But apparently some of these old problems are creeping back in. Anyway, all that is water under the bridge. I came out of prison on December the 21st, 2006. I wouldn't say I was a broken man, but I had great difficulty standing. I had great difficulty walking down the street. I couldn't step up onto the sidewalk because that little step was too painful to step. My muscles had gone to pot. They'd all turned to marmalade and jelly. And here I am a couple of years down the road, beginning to put my life back together again. For 6 months I lived in hotel rooms, tried to piece my life together again. All my possessions have been destroyed or lost. And now I'm back in this house here, not far from the castle where the Queen lives in Windsor. A lovely old English country house, surrounded by a beautiful country garden. And I've begun writing again. And I look back over my writing career. My writing career began back in the 1960s. I left England, a university. I'd been to an English public school. In public school, I was an active young scholar. In fact, there's a short strip of film showing me berating the crowd of students in the public school, Brentwood School. A piece of 60mm film taken by one of our school teachers. And I managed to find that recently. I left public school and went to university in London, and for 3 years I tried to get a degree. Not easy, because I came from a very poor background. My father no longer lived with us. My mother was an artist. She illustrated the Radio Times and other magazines, and you can't bring up 4 children on that kind of payment. And when you get to university, you find that some students are much better off than you are. I tried for 3 years to get a degree in physics. I changed over eventually to learning politics and economics at University College. Between that time, I went to Germany to work as a steel worker. It's a strange choice, you may think, but having been deferred from national service, I decided to volunteer for the Royal Air Force, like my brother. Rather than do 2 years national service, now that I was out of university, I decided to volunteer for the Royal Air Force to do a 3-year short service course, commission, flight lieutenant, Cambridge University, studying Russian. The idea was to get absolutely fluent in Russian. I've got no idea what use they would have made of me. I can suspect what I would have found myself doing eventually. But having volunteered for the Air Force, I was turned down. I've got no idea why. I can again suspect why I was turned down, because I'd been politically active at London University on the right wing. And these things happen. But the good news was that I now no longer had to serve either 3 years or 2 years, and I decided to go and be a steel worker in Germany instead. I applied to Krupp's, the great big giant steel firm who had turned out the tanks in World War II. And Krupp's turned me down. They sent back a rather snotty letter saying, "Dear Mr. Irving, in view of the fact that the Allies destroyed our steel works and dismantled everything we had, we don't have a job for you." So I applied then to Krupp's rivals, the great big Thyssen steel concern, Fritz Thyssen, who was one of the people who actually bankrolled Hitler in the 1930s. And Thyssen accepted me as an unlearned and an unskilled steel worker. And I worked on the steel work, on the furnace stage for many months in the Ruhr, the loneliest period of my life, in fact. You can't speak the language properly. You lose confidence when you're in a foreign country and you don't speak the language properly. I had advanced level German. Eventually, I think I had 13 advanced level subjects and 17 O-level subjects. So I had what you might consider to be a very wide but shallow knowledge. I knew a little about a lot of subjects rather than a lot about a little, which is the way you usually come out of university. Break for a moment. When I was at that steelworks, the Phoenix Rheinrohr Steelworks in Mülheim in the Ruhr, which had been rebuilt after the war, I lived in a bachelor home with I think about 12 other steelworkers, and we shared the beds. I think there were 4 beds there, and we were on a round-the-clock shift. The first time I'd ever worked on a shift plan. I never work on a shift plan again. I never want to have to be woken by an alarm clock again, as one of the resolutions I made. But one of the men who shared that room with me, he came from Leipzig, an old man. And he saw me one day reading a magazine about the World War, and the magazine had a series called "The Lights Went Out Over Europe," and it was about the bombing. And there was a story there about an air raid on Germany in 1945 that had killed 100,000 people in one night, a British air raid, and I knew nothing about this. He said, "I was there, David. I was in that city. It was Dresden. And my blood runs cold even now when I think about this. 100,000 people being burned alive in one night. I'd written an article for the Daily Telegraph, which they published a few weeks earlier, and I thought, well, I'm going to write an article about this one too. And I sat down and I began researching by writing letters to people and learning everything I could from that man, from other people, what had happened that night in Dresden. When I left the steelworks, I began to write, and I realized this wasn't just an article, this was a book. And I began advertising in the German newspapers and in the Times in England for people who had been in that raid, either in the air or on the ground. I advertised in American newspapers. Any American airman had taken part in the raid in Dresden the following midday. And eventually I filled the file with about 600 letters from people who had written to me. I went all around Germany. I did television programs. I was a bit of a, shall we say, a bit of a freak. This was an Englishman who was going to write about the bombing war. In Germany, the subject was taboo. Nobody talked about it. They weren't allowed to talk about it. So here was an Englishman who was breaking the taboo, and people sent letters to the TV stations. How could they tell me what they knew? They had been there too that day in Dresden. So I built up this fantastic file of letters from people who had been there or had been in the air. Eventually I went and spoke to Marshal of the Royal Air Force Bomber Harris, a great man, a great commander. I know people don't like him. I know people call him a war criminal, but you've got to admit that a man who is capable of sending 30,000 of his 50,000 airmen to their deaths, which they did unflinchingly, must be a great commander. I think he deserves that statue that he now has outside St. Bride's Church in Fleet Street. Bomber Harris told me that he hadn't wanted to carry out the air raid either, but he had been ordered to as a political decision by Churchill himself. I remember interviewing him back in April 1962. A great man. And I interviewed his deputy as well, Swansby. And the book that was finally published became a bestseller. I should explain, when that advert of mine appeared in the Times personal column, British authors seeking people who were in the air raid, I received a letter not just from the airmen or the survivors, but from a publisher, William Kimber. And Kimber said, David, if you're looking for a publisher, I will publish the book for you. I've always felt very strongly about that particular crime. And so suddenly I'd crossed the first threshold, which I didn't know, but turns out to be the most difficult threshold for any author, finding a publisher. He had approached me, he came to me. He was my publisher for the next 3 or 4 books, what we call an English gentleman publisher. A lovely man. When he died, the Telegraph asked me to write the obituary for him, which I did, half his obituary. He was such a gentleman, he never told me that authors get advances. He was that kind of a gentleman. And I don't suppose I really begrudged it. He published the book. It was a huge bestseller. The Sunday Telegraph serialized it. The editor of the Sunday Telegraph, which had just begun its life as a Sunday paper in 1963, the editor was Donald McLaughlin, who had been in naval intelligence in the famous submarine tracking room during World War II. He knew what he was talking about, and he took a personal interest in me. He published my next 3 books as serials in the Sunday Telegraph. You wouldn't believe that now, of course, if you read what the English newspapers write about me. My articles have been published in some of the world's leading newspapers, and in England, the Sunday Express, the Sunday Telegraph, the Sunday Times, and other newspapers all published series of articles by David Irving. But now, of course, I am hated and despised because I am what they call a Holocaust denier. And I'm going to come to that later on in this talk. I'm not. But this is what they call me now. That's not what they called me then. At that time, I was an enfant gâté. I was a chosen child, as they would say. And money was showered on me. I found an American agent, Max Becker, who became, I suppose, my principal source of income for the next 20 years. He died in 1992, and with his death, this was the first, well, not nail in my coffin, but it was a hammer blow to me. Max Becker, he contacted me and he said, David, I didn't want an agent, I have to say. I thought, why should I give an agent 10% for doing nothing? I'm writing the book and he's just going to sell the book for me. Why should he get 10%? Some of them get 15%. He telephoned me a few days after I hired him and he said, David, the American publishing house, Little Brown, they're going to buy your book on Field Marshal Milch, Hermann Goering's deputy, and they offered $30,000 for it. That was in 1967. Now, $30,000 even today it's a big sum of money. But in 1967 it was a bonanza. I remember, encouraged by that, I turned to my wife. We had had 4 children by then, and I said, we're going to move out of Paddington. And she said, where are we going to move to? I said, we have a choice. Either we can move out into the country and get a country house to live in, or we can move into the center. And she looked for a while, couldn't find somewhere to live, and I said, I can find somewhere in 2 hours, I guarantee. I drove down to Gloucester Road, went into an estate agents, Marlow and Marlow, and they looked up and they said, well, terribly sorry, you know, but you're looking for a 6-room apartment. Very difficult to find 6-room apartments now. They're too big, nobody wants them. Oh, there is an 8-room apartment in Mayfair, but nobody wants that. It's just off Grosvenor Square. And I said, how much will it be? And they said, well, £1,000 a year. And I thought, £1,000 a year? I can't possibly afford that, but we'll do it. So within 2 hours, I'd found his apartment in Grosvenor Square, in Duke Street, just between Grosvenor Square and Selfridges. It was an 8-room apartment on the first floor, what the Americans would call the second floor. And I lived there for the next 38 years. I bought the apartment eventually. Everything I owned was seized in the year 2002. Let me just say that straight away. By then it was worth over £1 million, but it was all taken away from me, along with all my possessions, everything, my archives, my library, my papers, everything I owned was seized in 2002. But for 38 years I lived in that apartment, very happily, raised the family, saw them go to school, saw them getting married, saw them off, wrote the books, which I'm going to be talking about now. Okay, rest?
Yeah.
When I was writing the book on Dresden, I went behind the Iron Curtain 2 or 3 times. In those days, Dresden was in the Soviet zone of Germany. I wanted to speak to the people there, and I was treated as something of a celebrity because they'd never seen this before. Somebody writing the history of their own tragedy. Every year in Dresden they had an annual ceremony of people coming from all over the city carrying candles and placing them on the ruins of the cathedral in the center of the city. And I found a man there called Fritz Hahn. Fritz Hahn had been a photographer during World War II. He was one of those professional photographers, dedicated photographer. We all know people like that, absolutely dedicated to their career of taking photographs. And he had recorded the life and times of the city of Dresden. And on February the 25th, 12 days after the air raid on Dresden, he got permission to go into the city centre, to go through the police cordons and take photographs of what he saw. The photographs were so horrific. They were the most horrific photographs I'd ever seen. There had been so many people killed in the air raid on Dresden. There weren't enough people left alive to bury them. So they were cremated on huge funeral pyres in the city square, in the centre of the city, piled up 500 or 1,000 at a time and set on fire. Horrible photographs of these people. A lot of the children wearing Mardi Gras costumes because the air raid had taken place on February the 14th, the night of February the 13th and the 14th, and the children were wearing their costumes for Shrove Tuesday. Horrible photographs. He had taken these photographs with the permission of the local Nazi Party officers, and they made my book. In fact, he gave me several colour photographs too, which he took, the colour transparencies. And I wasn't able to publish them for 20 or 30 years because in those days publishers were very mean, and they'd look at these colour photographs and say, well, yes, it's a great photograph, but it's going to cost an extra 10 cents on our production price, so we have to go without if they print them in colour. I showed the photographs to Wing Commander Maurice Smith. Maurice Smith at that time was the editor of Flight International magazine, and flying a single Mosquito bomber plane, a twin-engined wooden Mosquito plane. He had flown around that city at midnight for 1 hour, round and round and round, as the master bomber, like the master of ceremonies in a circus, broadcasting radio directions to the oncoming bomber stream to ignore that yellow flare, ignore the red flare, go just for the green flare. That was the target center, and broadcasting the stream of instructions. He gave me the actual transcript of his radio broadcast that night to the oncoming bombers. The bomber force was called the Plate Rack Force, which was, I suppose, a witty aspersion on Dresden's famous reputation as a production of fine porcelain. And I showed him the photographs of what was happening on the ground. And I've got to say that Wing Commander Maurice Smith was a fine gentleman, a typical Royal Air Force officer, dedicated and professional. And he went pink and then he went white when he saw these awful photographs that I showed him. It was an interesting thing. Many years later, I realized, as an author, you're dealing with real events. You're dealing with things that really happened. You're dealing with human beings. I was reminded of this after I'd written a book called The Destruction of Convoy PQ-17. It was my second or third book about a horrible Arctic convoy disaster in 1942. 38 ships had sailed, British and American, The Royal Navy escort had been withdrawn under a misapprehension. The Admiralty had decoded a signal wrong or drawn the wrong conclusions from it. So the Royal Navy escort effectively ran away and left the convoy to its own fate. Each merchant ship has gone its own way. 2/3 of them had been sunk by bombers or submarines, and I wrote this history. I found the bomber commanders, I found the U-boat commanders and crews, I found the survivors of the ships. It was a wonderful story. Each ship had its own fate. It was effectively a chapter for itself. And about 20 years later, I got a letter from an old lady written on Basildon Bond blue paper. And I will never forget the opening words. She said, "Dear Mr. Irving, I bought a copy of your book, The Destruction of Convoy PQ-17, on my local railway station here in Worthing, in Sussex. And for the first time, I have read how my husband died." Now, imagine that you're an author, and you've written a book like that. And I thought that her name was familiar. But suddenly you are reminded that you have written about somebody who really existed. In a sense of numb horror, I picked the book off the bookshelf and I turned to that page to see what I'd written about her husband. There were 3 or 4 pages. It was aboard a ship called the SS Hartlebury. 37 men had died aboard that ship and was torpedoed by a submarine. And her husband had been the radio operator. And there are 3 or 4 pages describing his end. Fortunately, I'd written it very accurately, and I'd given him a worthy epitaph, so to speak. But it was a salutary reminder when you do write history that you're writing about real people. And that even goes to somebody like Adolf Hitler. At that time, my publisher, William Kimber, said, after the destruction of Dresden, after that was a bestseller, he said, "David, what are you going to write next?" And I said, "I'm going to write a book about Adolf Hitler using the same methods. I'm going to advertise for people who knew him, people who were with him, his staff, his secretaries, his colonels, the adjutants, the people who knew him personally, man to man." And that the same as I did with the Dresden book. So you bypass all the existing history about him, and you find out what actually happened. It became what I now call real history, capital R, capital H. Real history. Churchill once said, "The job of a historian is to find out what happened and why." Well, a real historian who writes real history, his job is to find out what really happened. And that's what I tried to do. So eventually I tracked down a lot of people who had been with Adolf Hitler. And you've got to remember, I had an advantage over people like Ian Kershaw or even Hugh Trevor Roper. I'd written that book about Dresden. I remember what happened. I'd translated the memoirs of Field Marshal Keitel, who was hanged at Nuremberg as chief of the German High Command. A decent old buffer of a German soldier who hadn't thought very much about the orders he was signing. But I tracked down his son, because when I translated the memoirs, I found out that the German publishers had left out large chunks. And my English publisher, William Kimber, said, "David, can we find out what's been left out, do you think?" So I tracked down the son, and the son greeted me with open arms, and he said, "Thank goodness, yes, the German publisher cut out all the bits that were politically incorrect. For example, the Battle of Britain, because the British are our friends now." And it was absurd. So I put all this stuff back in the Keitel book. The English edition of the Keitel memoirs, the American edition too, is very different from the German edition in this respect. It's the complete story. And the son was so pleased that I'd gone the extra mile. Lieutenant Colonel Keitel he was. His father was the Field Marshal. The son opened the cupboard door, put his hand up inside the cupboard door, and brought down from inside this fabulous long Field Marshal's baton, which had belonged to his father. He said, "We hide it there in case the police take it from us." And he showed it to me. And he did me one other favor. He said, "Do you want to meet Otto Günscher?" And I said, "Well, yes. Is he still alive?" He said, "Yes, he lives just down the road from here." This is back in the 1960s. Otto Günscher was the man who burned Hitler's body. He was an SS colonel on Hitler's private staff for the last 10 years of his life, until literally the very last minute of his life. And Günscher opened the door, and Lieutenant Colonel Keitel said, "Otto, here is David Irving. This is the Englishman who wrote the book about Dresden." And that unlocked the door. It unlocked the door to all Adolf Hitler's staff. I was the Englishman who had written the book about Dresden, and therefore I was probably fair. And I was going to write an honest history. And eventually I was passed around the whole of the inner circle, the Adolf Hitler circle. And I was able to speak to all the people who had not spoken to anybody else before. So when Ian Kershaw and the rest write in their interviews, they decided not to interview Hitler's staff, for whatever reason. Ian Kershaw said, I would only have heard trite remarks from them. The correct explanation is that they wouldn't have spoken to him anyway, because he didn't have the right credentials, which I did. And I noticed one very interesting thing about these people. They were educated, they were academic, they were ordinary, decent citizens for the most part, and they all in private spoke glowingly of the chief. And this was a big shock to me. I thought, hey, hello. I was brought up in World War II. I'm born in 1938, brought up in World War II. He was the devil incarnate. He was the man with a little postman's hat and a toothbrush moustache to whom we had everything to owe because of Adolf Hitler. Because of that man, I had no toys. Because of that man, we had no butter. Because of that man, we had to turn off the lights everywhere we went in the house to save electricity. Adolf Hitler was to blame for everything. And of course, when the war ended, we had the photographs of Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald and all the other Nazi atrocities, which that man had caused. And yet all these educated people I'm now visiting, they're speaking well of him. So I began to realize, as my work on that particular topic progressed, and it lasted for 20 years, it's still going on now, in fact, that there were two Adolf Hitlers. There was the Madison Avenue Adolf Hitler, the Hollywood Adolf Hitler, and there was the man that these people had worked for, A.H., or the chief. And I thought, this man is worth investigating. You know, as you go through life, you can see the mistakes you make. You see the wrong turnings you take, like sitting on the back of an open truck. You can see too late where you should have turned off and taken another turning. And that was the mistake I made, to decide to write the truth about Adolf Hitler. Because from that moment on, it was like a watershed. Everything up to that point had been hunky-dory. I'd made the big money, the publishers had paid big sums of money. My books had sold well, they'd gone into all the bookstores, they were all inevitably bestsellers. The Sunday Times had given me the front page ranking every time when it came out, my latest book. Suddenly I was persona non grata. Suddenly my name stank. Looking back on it, you can say, well, that was a big mistake, David, because from that moment on you were no longer in the big money. Yes, but I can live with myself. My way of looking at it is to say, you have only one life. You've got one patch of life which is ended by the red lights up ahead. And you've got to use that life to the best you can. Either you can make the big money, if that's all you're after, or you can write something lasting where your children and the children's children can say, yes, my father wrote that book. My youngest daughter now, she was at school last term, and her school class was set the task of writing an essay on the air raid on Dresden, entirely by coincidence. Very interesting questions. Was the air raid on Dresden proportional? The question of proportionality, which is only a very modern concept in war. Proportionality. Whether proportionality had been exceeded in the air raid on Dresden. And of course, eventually it came out, her father had literally written the book. And she's not unproud of that, if I can put it. I mean, children are never really proud of their fathers when they're at school, but I think she's not unproud of the fact that I had written the book. And it's a book, I mean, thanks to my book, people now talk of Auschwitz, Hiroshima, and Dresden, all in one breath. Previously, Dresden was unheard of. So I spent the next 20 years writing the book on Adolf Hitler. I interviewed all his staff. I built up an immense card index. Bits of it are lying around in this room here, in my study. 40,000 index cards. Every document which I found in the archives was indexed. Every reference to Hitler. I decided I could afford to be choosy. I wasn't going to buy books about that man. I was going to write it from the documents, from the original telegrams. The problem is, of course, that over the years now more and more documents have come into the public domain. For example, the British over the last 10 years have just released tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of intercepted German messages, which are not in the German archives. So you can keep on updating and updating. But if you've done your work conscientiously, then you don't have to correct very much. It's they who have to correct what they've been writing, and they're very reluctant to do so, because their Adolf Hitler is a completely different man, omniscient, omnipotent, cruel, and criminal, whereas mine is a human, walking, talking man with breath that at the end of the war smelt, a man who was suffering from Parkinsonism, probably Alzheimer's too. A man who was gradually going down, a man who had been quite well portrayed in that recent film called The Downfall, Der Untergang, which is largely based on my book, as it turns out. Joachim Fest, the author, he had my book at his elbow as he wrote the script. So this is a problem that the others have, but I don't have, because if you write history accurately enough from the original records, you don't have to worry about being caught out. You may have misread somebody's handwriting. When the great Lipstadt trial occurred in the year 2000, the defense counsel who were defending Deborah Lipstadt, the American academic, who accused me of being a Holocaust denier, her defense counsel said Mr. Irving has made 19 major errors. Well, if we look at that, what does that mean? Defense counsel in that trial, the 2000 trial, my libel action against Deborah Lipstadt, they spent 20 man-years going through my books, all my books, looking for mistakes. And they said they'd found 19 mistakes. So now they say David Irving is a liar and a falsifier of history. The judge in that trial said 19 of those 19 mistakes, 12 he didn't accept as being mistakes. I think it's 12, which left 7. Seven mistakes in 30 books, a lifetime of writing. That's less than half a mistake per book. It's not bad for a historian. I remember a couple of historians at the time the action ended with a disastrous, spiteful and wounding 333-page judgment against me by the judge, Mr. Justice Gray. Two historians, Professor Donald Watt, who is the doyen of the English historians, he said, I don't think any historian's work could stand up to the kind of scrutiny to which it's been subjected in the way that David Irving's work has been subjected. And I'm not dismayed. I mean, as the outcome of that trial, of course, everything I had was seized, as I mentioned. I lost my archives. I lost everything I'd worked for. Every penny I had in the bank was seized. The defense counsel, the defense team in the Deborah Lipstadt case has spent $13 million justifying what she wrote, or attempting to justify it. And I think there's no British judge who would not be impressed to see $13 million flooding into his courtroom through a 6-inch pipeline. And the courtroom on one side being dominated by this huge team that Deborah Lipstadt had assembled behind her, with her Hollywood friends who put out the money, of course. She didn't have a penny. She was just an academic in Atlanta, a minor academic. And this huge team of 6 professors and all their assistants and all their research assistants and all the barristers and counsel and solicitors assistants, 40 of them, every day coming into the High Court on one side of the High Court, and on the other side of the High Court, myself, because I was acting alone, a litigant in person. You're faced with a choice, you know, in law. People sometimes say, why do you act for yourself? Why did you hire a lawyer? Oh, those of you who have ever had to hire a lawyer will know why you don't hire lawyers, if you can possibly avoid it. They don't care about you. They take your money and run, time and time again. And you don't hire lawyers in a libel action because you've got a choice. You have, in my case, you're going to hire a lawyer who knows nothing about history. Or you've got a historian who knows nothing about the law. But at least if you're a historian, you can learn enough about the law to fight a case in the High Court, which is what I did. And George Carman, the famous British QC, he told his son, when the Lipstadt trial ended, that if he had been the judge, he would have judged in my favor. So it was as closely run as that. But we're getting away from the subject. I wrote, after the Adolf Hitler book appeared in 1977, probably another 20 books. I never counted them. I'm a bit superstitious like that. I don't think the road has come to an end until it comes to an end. And then I'll look back and say, well, okay, you wrote whatever it is, 30, 35, I've got no idea. I wrote these books mostly about World War II, mostly about personalities, because, of course, after a time you do get into what you can call a rut. You built up this huge archive of Adolf Hitler documents, Nazi documents. You built up the expertise, you've got the contacts, you speak the fluent German, you understand the abbreviations and the acronyms and the language that's being used. So you can write the books increasingly easily. I'll give you one example. As a byproduct of the Adolf Hitler research, I'd interviewed every surviving field marshal, or I'd contacted their wives or widows, and I'd obtained all their private papers. For example, Field Marshal Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox. I visited his wife and son, Manfred, who was the Lord Mayor of Stuttgart at that time. The wife, the widow, had given me complete access to all the private papers. He had written 2,000 letters to her, the Field Marshal, Rommel. And I might say that letters are much more valuable than diaries. I've discovered over the 30 years or 40 years of my writing career that many diaries are fake. Sometimes entirely faked, like the Adolf Hitler diaries in 1983, or sometimes partially faked. People have gone back and rectified their diaries. Even Rommel did this in 1941. November 1941, he lost the battle of Operation Crusader in the desert. And he went back in 1942 and took the page out of his war diary and had it retyped to amend the wrong order he had given. But of course, he made the mistake that we all make at the beginning of every year when we go into a bank with a checkbook. Instead of writing 1941, November 1941, he accidentally wrote November 1942 on that page. So you spot the faking. Okay, well, this is human. And the point I'm making is that I had all the Rommel material already, which I'd collected when writing the Hitler book. And now along came Max Becker, my agent, and said, David, what are you going to write now? You finished the Hitler book. And I said, what about a book about Rommel? And this is the stark truth about being an author, unfortunately. You write big books that are important, like the Adolf Hitler biography, Hitler's War, or Churchill's War, the Churchill biography. And if you take 20 or 30 years to write a book, the Churchill book, the contract was signed in 1972. Here we are 35 years later, and Volume 3 has still not been published. You're not going to make money from that, are you? But you have a book like the Rommel biography, which takes eventually 6 months to write, and it makes a fortune. And it's very unjust, but it's the way that things are done. You use the unimportant books like the Rommel book to finance the important books by which you'll always be remembered. I'm not going to be remembered for my Rommel biography, although it appeared to rave reviews from all the British press. I remember the Times published a review beginning with the words, David Irving is accustomed to having his books excoriated. He won't be happy with what we're going to write about the Rommel book, therefore, that it's a wonderful piece of research. The Rommel book made so much money, in fact, that I was able to alter my lifestyle. It came out at the same year as the Hitler biography, eventually, because the Hitler book took a lot of editing. It came out at the end of 1977. In Germany, it came out in 1978, one of the most prestigious German publishers, Hoffmann and Camper. I know they printed over 70,000 copies in hardback. They sold 70,000 copies in hardback. For each book, of course, my share is about £2 or £3. Plus all the paperback deals. So in Germany alone, from the Rommel biography, I picked up about £150,000. I remember walking to my bank and drawing out £10,000 and £15,000 from the bank in a brown paper bag, and walking around to Jack Barclay's showroom in Mayfair, where they sell the Rolls Royces. I mean, I can be very shallow. And walking into that showroom and saying to the salesman, I want to buy a Rolls Royce, please. And he said, which one are you looking at? They do cost a lot of money, sir. I thought he was looking at my shoes or my suit. And I say, what do you think I'm carrying in the brown paper bag, then? And I put it on his desk. And he said, oh, which one would sir like? And I said, one of those two silver shadows in the window. And he said, which one do you want? And I said, I think I'll have the nigger brown one in the corner. He said, we call it coffee bean brown, sir. I'm just giving that as an example of the way language changes. At the time I used that phrase, it was a perfectly inoffensive and innocuous word, but now, of course, it's become politically incorrect. It was a color, just like burnt sienna. But I drove that coffee bean brown Rolls around England for the next 12 years. I drove it around a large part of Europe too, in fact. The unusual experience of this car getting more and more valuable as the years went past. I bought it at the height of the Arab oil crisis when nobody was buying gas guzzlers. So I got it quite cheap. And I drove it for the next 12 years, in fact. And I drove it around inside the Soviet zone of Germany and Hungary and other communist countries. In Germany, West Germany, huge crowds would gather around a Rolls-Royce. But as soon as you went through Checkpoint Charlie into East Germany, unfortunately, nobody knew what it was, and there was a matter of great indifference to them. So it was a different experience. But it was a great pleasure to drive something truly British like the Rolls-Royce. I've always been a patriot. I was accused in the Lipstadt trial, of course, of being a racist. That's the other word for patriot. When Richard Rampton, the Queen's counsel for Deborah Lipstadt, said, you are a racist, aren't you? And I said, well, what do you mean by racist? And he said, how would you define it? I said, Mr. Rampton, I would define what you call racism as patriotism. He said, how would you define patriotism? I said, patriotism is respect for the country that's been handed down to you by your parents and by their parents. And what country is that, Mr. Irving? Well, I can't deny, of course, that I'd gone through this kind of dialogue in my mind for months before the trial began. So the answer that came wasn't unprepared. I said, Mr. Rampton, sometimes I have the dream that I can go to Heathrow Airport and board a 747 and fly for 10 hours and land back in England as it was in the 1950s. The press loved that. And he wasn't satisfied, of course, because he doesn't like that kind of answer, Mr. Rampton. He was a good QC. And he adjusted his wig and he said, Mr. Irving, what kind of England would that have been then? I know what he's going for. And I said, Mr. Rampton, let me put it like this. If the soldiers who stormed the beaches in Normandy in June 1944 could see England as it is today, they wouldn't have gone 40 yards up that beach. It's a wonderful sentence. Again, well prepared. It came out absolutely word perfect. Every newspaper quoted it the following day because newspapers are cowardly. There are things that they want to say, things that they dare not say themselves, but things they will willingly quote if somebody else says it. And if necessary, they can put exclamations up front and center, and they can say how disgusting it is that somebody has dared to say this, but they've said it all the same. And it became the quote of the week in most of the Sunday papers, and in 2 of the Sunday papers it was the actual quote of the month. So they all believed in what I had said, but none of them had dared say it themselves. That's the quality of English journalism today. The problem isn't censorship. There is no censorship of newspapers. The problem has always been self-censorship. A journalist knows what he's got to write in order to keep his job. And the present, unfortunately, flavour of the month is hit Irving, hit him, because that's the way to please the editors, because that's the way to please the advertisers. And all the Free Street newspapers now are heavily dependent on the advertisers, and we all know who we're talking about. So hit Irving, and that'll keep us in our jobs in the long run. And I can live with that. I've never taken advertising. I'm not dependent on advertising. I write what I find in the archives. When I came out of that prison in Vienna, December the 21st, 2006, the following day, I was at the BBC in White City, and I was being interviewed by John Humphreys for the Today programme. And he said, what will you do now? Are you going to change what you are? And I said, no, I shall continue to write what I find in the archives. He said, you're going to write what you find in the archives? What's that? I said, the truth, real history. And he said, but no one's going to believe what you write now, because you're David Irving, you have a criminal record now. And I said, yes, that is the intention of my enemies, that the shallow-minded journalists should describe me as that. But let me tell you what's going to happen in future years. In future years, people buying books are going to have a choice between books written by David Irving, or by Andrew Roberts, or by Ian Kershaw, or by some other run-of-the-mill historian, and they'll say, well, David Irving has been to prison for what he writes. So on balance, we're going to believe what he has written rather than what they write. I think 100 years from now, my books will be the bedrock of history, which people draw back on when they want to find out what went wrong in the 20th century. And about what went wrong in the 20th century, I'll talk in a minute. Cut.
Okay, just for my editing purposes, this is, which bit are we going to do first?
Segment A. We're going to do segment A. This is about family and the Lipstadt trial.
Okay, and this is going to be slotted back in to further into the,
that's right.
into the film that
That's right.
Come on. 2 seconds then. Okay.
Ready?
Yeah.
Segment A. People sometimes ask me why I've not replied to the many books that have been written about the Lipstadt trial. The trial took place in the year 2000 in January, and it lasted until April, 3 months in the High Court in England. And people say, David, would you do it again? And I'd say, in a heartbeat. It's a very interesting experience to act as your own litigant, to act in person in the High Court. If you've studied the language and the law enough, and if you know the history, of course. But before I deal with the trial, I'm going to go back a bit to deal with my family, and you'll only understand why when we come to the end of this. First of all, after the trial was over, it ended in a catastrophic defeat for me. Probably no surprise, because the defendants in this action, Deborah Lipstadt and her publishers, Penguin Books, had spent about $13 million donated by Hollywood sponsors, and I'm not going to bother to name them because I don't want to be accused of anti-Semitism. Steven Spielberg was one. They spent so much money defending the action. I suppose the result was inevitable in the long run, and had very little to do with the actual libel on my name. I was accused of being a Holocaust denier, the implication being that I had known what the truth is, and having known what the truth was, and having it scattered around me on my desk in my study in Grosvenor Square, Mayfair in London, I'd deliberately written the opposite. I tried to say to the judge, you've got to understand, what this court is occupied with is not what happened 60 years ago in Auschwitz and Treblinka and the other camps. What this court should concern it with is what happened in my study when I was writing the books. Was I deliberately lying? But the court somehow got dragged back into the years of the Holocaust, and I suppose that was inevitable. Deborah Lipstadt, after the trial was over, went on speaking tours around the world, and she's still doing it now, 7 or 8 years later. Dog and Pony show is going around city after city and country after country, in which she acts the part of the dragon slayer, how she slew David Irving, the historian, and destroyed my career and reputation and all the rest of it. I don't think she has. One very interesting remark she made, however, was when she was speaking in Israel to an audience there. She said, we did all we could to destabilize David Irving before the trial began. Well, you can recognize that if you ever come up into my archive room and have a look at the boxes of papers there. You will see that in the final 10 days before the trial began, literally in the final 10 days, they dumped huge quantities of paper on me. Ring binders full of thousands of pages of documents that I was supposed to read before the trial began. Of course, I had no hope of reading these documents. A month before the trial began, they actually changed their entire defense. They threw out the defense they had originally served 5 years earlier and replaced it with this new defense, which basically centered on smearing my name. And then instead of, I suppose I should have gone to the judge at that point. This was a mistake I made. I should have gone to the judge, Mr. Justice Gray, and say either we have to delay the trial now by 6 months to give me time to read all these new documents, or you as judge in charge of this courtroom have to tell the defendants they've had their chance and they're not permitted to change their defense just 1 month before the trial begins. This is one of the mistakes I made. You make mistakes when you're a litigant in person. I didn't realize you could do that kind of thing. But remember what she said. We did all we could to destabilize him. So let me just come back to describe my family. There's a reason for this. By the time the trial began, I had 4 beautiful daughters. I now have 5 daughters. My daughters were born to my wife, who was born to a noble family in Spain, and they're scattered around the world now. 2 of them in Madrid, and 1 lives in Australia. And the 4th, the oldest child, Josephine, our darling Josephine, was dead. She was born in 1963. She was born in the same month that my Dresden book appeared. She was born on April the 1st, 1963, and my book, The Destruction of Dresden, appeared on the last day of that month. We called her Josephine Victoria because April the 1st is not April Fool's Day in Spain, it's the day of victory, the day celebrating General Franco's victory over the communists. So we called her Josephine Victoria. Now she was dead. At the age of about 18, it turned out that she had an incurable disease. It was a desperate disease, a disease that could be treated but not cured. It was a brain disease. We had noticed something going gradually wrong over the years before that, and over the following 18 years of her life, until the time she was in her mid-30s, the disease got worse and worse, and she was living in Covent Garden, and she found a husband, a fiancé, and I'm glad to say that a year before the end she actually married him. She had a son, Tony. Tony is now a British Army rifleman. I'm very proud of him. Last year he was given a mention in dispatches for saving the lives of 2 of his comrades in Iraq. He has served 4 tours in Iraq, and now he's in Afghanistan, serving his 3rd tour in Afghanistan. I placed a copy of the mention in the dispatches in the drawer containing the ashes of his mother. We're a close family. When she realized that she was incurably ill, Josephine gradually began to decline. She was a beautiful child, very clever, I'd noticed something very bright about her in the very earliest years of her life. She was so clever that she jumped a whole year at the French Lycée in South Kensington, which possibly put an added strain on her brain, I don't know. In 1996, the year that my book on Dr. Goebbels was published, I might mention that I'd been in Moscow in the KGB archives, and I was the only historian to have found the private diaries of Dr. Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister. I was the only person who could read them anyway in his handwriting, and I brought them back and I published the diaries, the biography of Dr. Joseph Goebbels, called Goebbels, the Mastermind of the Third Reich, and it was published in 1996 in Britain. It was never published in America because Deborah Lipstadt had put pressure on my publishers, St. Martin's Press, and on all the publishing journals in the United States, Publishers Weekly and Kirkus and the rest, not to publish any more books by me. My publisher in America had resisted this pressure for 6 weeks, as they said, we're not going to surrender, and I thought to myself, yes, you will, and eventually they did. That was 1996. In the beginning of May 1996, I got a fax from my publishers in Martin's Press telling me that they were not going to publish a book after all. Deborah Lipstadt was to blame for that. But I was overshadowed by a far crueler event that happened that month. Josephine, my oldest daughter, tried to kill herself. A brave doctor in the London hospital had saved her life, had operated on her for 14 hours, had unfortunately been left with no choice after a few days but to amputate her limbs. And for the remaining 2 years of her life, 3 years of her life, poor Josephine lived in a wheelchair with no legs, her back broken, and her limbs, her arms shattered. She was a lovely girl. She came around to see me in 1999, about 4 months before the trial began. Her husband wheeled her round from Covent Garden, where she lived, and she came to visit me in Mayfair. I'm very proud of her. She frequently visited me. She couldn't come up in the elevator anymore because the elevator was too small for her wheelchair. We had a chat. She was talking about buying a car and would I pay for the insurance for her, and all the things that passed between a daughter and her father. And on an instinct, just before she left, I said to my secretary, a legal assistant, I'd hired two law students as assistants. I said to Catherine, would you just run upstairs and get my camera, please? And I had Catherine take a picture of me standing next to Josephine outside our front door. I never saw her again. A few weeks later, she succeeded where she'd failed before and killed herself. I suppose the pain was unbearable, and it was a desperate, desperate day for me. I was sitting in my office when my sister phoned with the news. You're going to wonder why I'm mentioning all this in connection with the Lipstadt trial. Well, you then have a week, which I suppose is the worst week in a father's life. You telephone around the world to all her sisters and break the news to them. And then you have the awful preparation of the funeral. She was a Catholic. We had the funeral ceremony in the most beautiful Catholic church in Mayfair. And my family came in from all around the world. And the church was full. She had many friends. I had no notion of all the family friends, all our friends, and all her friends from the Covent Garden area where she lived. And that afternoon I went back to my study. We had a reception, and then everyone left and I was alone. And the telephone rang. And it was the undertakers. A wonderful firm of English undertakers who I'd had to contact a week earlier. I mean, when you're a father, you're not accustomed to this, bearing your own children. And they knew this, and they said, Mr. Irving, you need have no worries. We handled the arrangements for Admiral Lord Nelson, you know. And they phoned that afternoon after the reception, after the funeral, after I'd kissed the coffin goodbye. And they said, Mr. Irving, something rather odd has happened. A wreath has been delivered here, and it's too late for the service. What shall we do? And I said, well, tell me, is there a card attached? They said, yes, there's a card attached, and it's a very expensive wreath. It must have cost many hundreds of pounds. It's white lilies and white roses. I said, well, please send it round straight away, because I will have to thank the people who sent the wreath. And the wreath was delivered by a courier an hour later to my front door. It never came upstairs. I read it and the card downstairs in the street. And I went upstairs and got a camera and took a photograph of the card. The card read in German, I'm sorry, I took a photograph of it. The card read, "Truly a merciful death." And the signature was Philip Buhler and Friends. That would mean nothing at all to anybody who didn't know the history of the Nazis and the Third Reich. Merciful death, Gnadentod, was the Nazi euphemism for for euthanasia, killing the disabled. Philip Buhler, who had apparently signed this card, had been dead since 1945. He was Hitler's left-hand man. He was head of the euthanasia program. He killed himself in 1945 at the end of the war. This was a nasty little smear been sent by somebody with more than enough money to spare, aimed at destabilizing me 2 or 3 weeks before the trial began. It was the nastiest thing that has ever happened to me. I'm not going to say that Deborah Lipstadt herself was personally involved in this. I was sufficiently worried by this that I took a photograph of the card because I thought it may be just a smear wreath today, a hate wreath today, tomorrow it may be a pipe bomb. So I took a photograph of the card before I destroyed the wreath. I phoned the undertakers. They were very shocked. They said, "We can't understand how this happened, sir." It came from the Bloomsbury florists. I visited the Bloomsbury florists that afternoon, and as I came away from them, they were very embarrassed, of course, and very shocked. And they sent around a wonderful wreath of flowers afterwards. And they said that the man who bought this wreath, the white wreath, the roses and the lilies, he looked like he had a Middle Eastern appearance. He looked very wealthy. He was very well dressed. As I walked away from the shop, I found myself passing the front door of Deborah Lipstadt's lawyers 100 yards away. It was a very unpleasant experience. The trial lasted 3 months, but I never ever forgot what had happened to Josephine and the use to which my enemies had put it. I'm not going to go into the details of the trial here because it's too complicated to go into. But it was a very unpleasant experience. Any parent who's lost a child will know what I went through. I was destabilized for many weeks afterwards. When I was touring America in the summer of 2005, I received a message from the students who were going to invite me to Vienna. They said, could I come to Vienna and speak to a student organization, what the Austrians call a student corporation. You know, dueling corporation. In Austria they still have duels and they fight with real sharp sabers, with proper padded clothing and the rest, but the idea is to try and make a slash on your enemy's face, on your opponent's face. And in Austria it's still allowed, and in Germany too, of course. During World War II it was allowed, and some of the top Nazis, like Kaltenbrunner, had the scar, the Schmiss, on their cheeks to prove that they were a member of a dueling federation, a student body. The student body that invited me apparently was called the Olympia. I said to the students who contacted me by email, I will certainly come and speak to you in Vienna, but let's make the arrangements over the next 3 months, rendezvous and times, because I want it scattered widely. We made 2 or 3 rendezvous, rendezvous A, rendezvous B, rendezvous C, and arranged times and dates. And I left it until the time approached in November 2005. You may wonder why we needed these arrangements. And the reason was that I'd spoken in Austria in 1989, 16, 17 years earlier, 20 years ago now. I've spoken all around Austria with the permission of the Austrian government. They had actually assigned police officers to attend every meeting I spoke at our request, so that we could justify that I'd stayed within the law with the remarks I made, because Austria and Germany, you've got very tight rules on what you're allowed to say. And at the end of that particular 1989 tour, I'd had to leave Austria in a hurry, if I can put it like that, because word was handed down that the Minister of the Interior, a criminal called Karl Blecher, had actually issued an arrest warrant against me. I call him a criminal because of operations he was subsequently found guilty of. And I managed to get away from Austria in time, but one assumed that these things were done for what they call optical reasons, aus optischen Gründen, as they say in German. And I went back to Austria 2 or 3 times after that. For example, when I went to interview the girlfriend of Dr. Joseph Goebbels, Lida Barrover, a beautiful film actress, still living in Austria in her 80s, a wonderful, stately woman. And I wanted to interview her and ask her some very detailed and rather intimate questions about her friendship with Dr. Goebbels. 1993 that was, in July. Nothing happened. In and out, waved in, waved out by the police, checked on the computer. So I assumed that all this talk about in the restaurant was old hat. Even so, when I went to Austria to speak to the students in 2005, 17 years later, I'm not totally stupid. I'm a Boy Scout. Boy Scouts have on their belt buckle the words, "Be prepared." So I took 8 shirts with me, instead of just the regular one for a 2-day trip. You never know how long you're going to be staying there. You didn't expect to be arrested and imprisoned, but you were prepared for it in case you were. I also prepared a page on my website to be posted in the event that I didn't manage to go back to London. And left detailed instructions with my family on how to put it on the website, should I not return. Again, I was prepared. And I can give one example of that. In fact, years earlier, when I was traveling to Europe with my wife, we couldn't afford to fly in the 1960s, so we used to go by boat. And I used to take a 6-foot length of string with me, hidden in my luggage. I never told my wife that, but the idea was that if the ferry sank, then I could tie our life jackets together. We wouldn't drift apart in the night. You didn't expect it to sink, but you were prepared. So I'm a Boy Scout. So on the night I flew to Austria to speak to the students, I didn't actually fly to Austria. I flew to the next country, Switzerland. Landed in Basel, drove all night, 500 miles into Vienna, and got to Vienna at 9 o'clock in the morning in a Swiss rental car, and telephoned the students, not easily, from a telephone, a payphone in Vienna, because every phone had been wrecked by immigrants, stealing the cash, mostly Romanian. And I phoned the student, spoke to the student who had invited me. I should actually say that the word student has quotation marks around it, because I'm still not sure he was a student. I think he was probably a secret state official, secret state police. And I said 2 words. I said, "Rendezvous B," in 1 hour. And Rendezvous B was the ticket hall in the local Western Railway station. 1 hour later, I stood in that rendezvous, not actually in the rendezvous point, but on a balcony overlooking it to see who else was going to be waiting for me there. Anybody with guns or anybody with baseball bats like Chicago. Nobody else came there except eventually one student, or somebody looked like a student looking for somebody. So we went and introduced ourselves and went immediately to somewhere else and had a coffee. And I said, I've been driving all night. So I'm going to have to lie down for an hour or two. When am I speaking tonight? And he said 6 o'clock. I said, how many students are going to be there? He said, there'll be 200 students there. Oh, I said, 200? I thought it was going to be like 5 or 10. He said, no, he said, you can trust them. This is a student body, the Olympia. They're not going to talk out of school. So, okay, you get a bit nervous at this point. And I said I've got to lie down somewhere because I've been driving all night. And he took his cell phone, what the Germans call a handy. He took a cell phone and he phoned somebody who said, Herr Irving will be there at 1 o'clock this afternoon already, not just at 6 o'clock, because he's been driving all night. Okay, he put the phone down. He said, that's okay, Mr. Irving. I mentioned this phone call because the only people who knew I was going to be there at 1 o'clock were me and him, and the person he had just phoned. We drove over to the student building, parked around the back, 1 street behind it. We walked up the side of the student building. As we walked up, I said, oh, by the way, is there a back exit I can get out of if there's an emergency? I'm always thinking ahead. Be prepared. And he said, there's no back exit, I'm sorry. So you begin to feel a little bit more worried now at this point. I felt even more worried as we turned the corner into the main street with the student entrance on it. And it's empty apart from 3 men on the opposite side of the street who immediately peeled off the wall as they see me come around the corner and start walking diagonally across the street towards me. 3 big burly men wearing wind jackets. I say to him, who are they? He says, I don't know. And then as we get close, he says, the middle one, I recognize him. He's Gestapo. Gestapo, Staatspolizei, state police. The old Gestapo, you remember, in the Hollywood movies, the Gestapo. They don't call it state police now. In Austria, they call it the Government Agency for the Protection of the Constitution and Anti-Terrorism. It hasn't got quite the same ring as Gestapo. But we walked straight through them. I just said Mahlzeit to them, good afternoon, and we walked straight through, and that rather nonplussed them because they hadn't expected me to speak German to them, I suppose, or the local vernacular. And I said, we'll go in the pub on the corner and discuss what to do next. And he said, no, it's too late, they're following us. I never saw him again. He split off one way, I split off down back behind the building again, followed by one of these 3 thugs. I thought they were thugs. I didn't believe they were police. And he didn't, the policeman who was following me 100 yards behind me didn't realize I had a car stacked around the back of the building. I got around the back of the building, and I can see the car parked there at the end of the street, the far end of the street. I walk down the middle of the street, brisk, with a brisk step, shall we say, not running, but not actually walking. And the guy is gradually gaining on me. He doesn't know what I'm planning to do. Probably not even certain it's me. And as I draw level with the car, I press the keys in my pocket, and I hear the answering clunk coming from the locks as the doors of the car unlock, and I jump into the right-hand side of the car, and I sit down and I slam the doors, I lock the doors, and then I realize there's no steering wheel. I'm on the wrong side of the car. This is a Swiss car, not an English car. It's a stupid thing to do. So it's a bad position now. I'm in Austria. I'm in enemy territory. I've got the secret state police after me, and I'm sitting in the passenger side of an otherwise empty car trying to make a quick getaway. Not a good idea. I can begin to hear music playing, in fact, you know, the Harry Lime theme from The Third Man. That happened in Vienna too, but Harry Lime managed to get away through a sewer, a manhole cover in the street. He vanished into the sewer system. I can't see any sewers around. I managed to get out of the car in time and jump into the driver's seat and lock the doors again. The guy hasn't quite caught up with me. And I drive away in a flurry of gravel and burning rubber, look in the mirror, and there he is standing in the middle of the road, and he's writing down the license tag of the car. Not good. The Harry Lime theme is beginning to play louder. I mean, in retrospect, it's all rather funny. At the time, it was rather frightening. I went and parked the car. I phoned the student on his handy. I said, "Are we going to go ahead tonight somewhere else or not?" And he said, "No, tonight is off." So I said, "Good, that's all I wanted to hear. I'm out of here then." And years later, of course, you think, hello, that's funny. He's been picked up by the police and he's gone off with them in custody. Yet they let him keep his cell phone and take phone calls on it. What's going on here? He never visited me in prison. I never saw him again. I never heard a word from him. He answered no letters. My lawyers wrote them. He didn't answer them. I'm pretty certain he was a government agent. I'd been ambushed. But I could still have got away. I bought a map. The map showed that there were autobahns all the way around Vienna, the ring road. And there was an autobahn, the A2, which headed due south into Italy. I wasn't going to go west again, not back the way I'd come, because that would be the way they would expect me to go in a Swiss car. So I headed south. And I'm driving south down the A2 for a couple of hours. Darkness falls. I'm keeping a steady speed, well inside the speed limit. No other problems at all. And the sat-nav comes on my car. Suddenly a voice says, "You're on the A2. You're 200 miles south of Vienna." And I'm thinking to myself, well, who else knows I'm 200 miles south of Vienna? Well, the answer is that way ahead, a mile ahead, I can see a police car cruising at the same speed as me. So I'm anxious not to overtake it in case my number has been put out on the system. I thought it very unlikely. But I think to myself, in 20 minutes, I'm over the border in Italy and safe. Then I'm going to head across Italy, into Switzerland, up Switzerland, into Basel, catch the plane back to London, British Airways, and I'm back home with my family tomorrow night as planned. But then in my mirror behind me, I can see there's a police car just 20 yards behind me. And then, now they're together, they box me in. Another police car comes in, and I'm forced off at high speed onto the hard shoulder of the road. And again, you do crazy things in a moment like this. It's not something you're accustomed to. I pick my tape recorder up off the passenger seat, because I've been dictating notes. And I think, like a historian that I am, like a journalist that I could be, let's record exactly what happens next, so in case there's any dispute. I'm about to switch on the tape recorder and point it at the police who are running towards me, when I can see that these 8 policemen running towards me are all holding black Glock automatics, 9mm automatics in their hands, pointing at my head and screaming at me to put my hands up. That's a very uncivilized feeling, I might say. If you have one Glock pointed at your head with the guy's finger actually on the trigger, not on the guard, this is an uncivilized feeling. You've got 8 of them screaming at you. It's worrying. Seconds later, I'm sitting on the back seat of the police car, my hands handcuffed behind my back. And of course, that's not a good time. If they're screaming at you with their gun, it's not a good idea to point a metal tape recorder at them. Because later on, they'll say, "We thought he had a gun in his hand." That's, in the United States, of course, you would have had a gun in your hand, because all the police there have a throw-down gun, just in case of an embarrassing situation like that. So they can say, "This was his gun." Seconds later, I'm sitting on the back seat of the car, and I can hear them saying, "We've caught the car thief." I say, "Hold it right there, gentlemen. I'm not a car thief. I'm a geriatric English writer. Here's the car rental papers. You'll find them in the glove compartment of my car. I'm not a car thief." "Shut up," screaming. And then you realize, of course, they've been told I'm a car thief, a dangerous armed car thief. Because otherwise, how are they going to justify stopping me and pushing me off onto the hard shoulder at high speed? And this is the problem I had later on in prison too in Vienna. The guys come up to you in the prison yard, and you've got a choice there. Either you say, okay, I'm just a historian, I don't know what I'm doing here, in which case they're all going to laugh at it, they're not going to take you seriously. Or you do what I did. You develop what Tom Wolfe called the pimp walk in his book, whatever it was. You develop the pimp walk. And now you strut around like some big, burly Negro prisoner. And you need to mess with me at your own risk. So you don't say that. They come up to you and they say, I mean, most of them are in there for murder or drug dealing or kidnapping or rape or drive-by shootings. And there you are, you're this aged historian who's written 30 books and you don't quite know what you're doing there. And they come up to you and they say, what are you in for then? In various languages. You don't say what you're actually, you say, it's a good thing you don't know what I'm in for, man. You know, I had my hair cut very short, just 1 millimeter all over. And believe me, when I got my hair cut down to 1 millimeter, I look really ugly and nasty. Bad enough as it is like this, but really ugly and nasty with my hair really short. So you say, you don't want to mess with me. Better you don't know what I'm in for, right? Let's leave it at that. And you gradually earn a little bit of respect in the prison yard. It wasn't so good, though, 3 months later when I went into the big courtroom. The big courtroom, they had chosen for my show trial the biggest courtroom in Austria, in the same building, the Justice Palace in Vienna. A 200-year-old building. The prison had 1,400 prisoners in it, built for only 800. It was where they carried out the executions, rather like Pentonville in London. And for the first time now, for the David Irving trial, they'd relaxed the rule of 30 or 40 years, and the press, photographers and film cameras were allowed into the courtroom for the first 20 minutes. It was an absolute bare ground. It was a nightmare. I could see through the crack in the door as I waited outside in handcuffs. But I'd had time to prepare for it. I knew I was going to be led into the courtroom, and I knew that the world's press were going to be there. I could see 200 photographers massed on the other side of that door, all pointing towards the slit in the door that I was going to come through. And I'd got a copy of my Hitler biography. I haven't got it here. Where is my Hitler biography? Everything's gone. Here we are, Hitler. I'll get it, I'll get it. So I could see the press through that crack in the door. 200 press photographers, a television cameramen from all around the world on the other side of that door. And I prepared for this as soon as I knew this was going to happen. And I'd got a copy of my book out of the property room, Hitler's War. Here it is. And for 3 days in my little wet room in my cell, my solitary cell, I'd practiced holding this book in handcuffs, not easy, and a fountain pen, because I'm a writer. And I practiced how to hold it so that we didn't obscure Adolf Hitler, and we didn't obscure the title, because I thought this photograph was going to be around the world in every newspaper tomorrow. And it was. And as luck would have it, when the appeal came, of course, at the end of the year, after 400 days in solitary confinement, the court had ordered Mr. Irving not to be allowed to carry any books. So I scored one there. The other nightmare was coming into the courtroom and looking frantically. The first thing you look for is the jury, see what kind of folks you're looking at. There was a jury, 12 people there, and I'm sorry, it wasn't 12 people. There was a jury, and it wasn't 12 people, it was 8. And of these 8, 7 were women. Now, I don't know if you ever remember that Jack Lemmon film, I think it's called How to Murder Your Wife or something like that, where he goes up to the jury and he says to, or is it Walter Matthau, and he says, haven't you all wished, gentlemen, that you had the chance of pressing a little button and getting rid of your wife? Well, here are 7 women who had the chance, middle-aged, menopausal women who had a chance to press that little invisible button on the rail in front of them and get rid of some unfortunate man. And that was me. The other nightmare thing you find out about the Austrian court system is the judge goes into the jury room and debates with the jury. He directs the jury on their deliberations. Unthinkable in the British and American legal system, jurisprudence, that the judge would go into the jury room. The keystone of the English and American legal system is the total independence of the jury. The jury comes up sometimes with very odd decisions indeed, like the O.J. Simpson case. But so be it. No, in Austria, the Allies insisted the judge should be allowed to go into the jury room so the judge can tell the jury what to think. And what the jury thought was that I should get 3 years prison, which was, I must admit, a severe shock for me, because I know how cruel the Austrian prison system is. Eventually, I sacked my own lawyer at that time, who had turned out to be completely ineffective, He knew nothing, so far as I could see, about the banning law, and he was not prepared to put up a fight for me. He went into that courtroom completely unprepared. He had no speech or submissions to make to the jury. And during the ensuing months, I sacked him and replaced him with Dr. Schaller, who was a very, very fine, tough, octogenarian Austrian lawyer. And he secured my immediate release by the Court of Appeal. It was an interesting experience. You sit for 400 days in a room with no interruptions at all. You're in the safest place on earth. You've got a 6-inch thick steel door like a bank safe between you and the outside world. You have no telephone, no cell phone. For the first 3 months, you don't even get letters. I didn't even know that people had written to me. Eventually, 2,000 people wrote to me from all around the world, including letters addressed to David Irving, the Gulag, Austria. They too were delivered to me. And it's a wonderful environment for a writer. I didn't tell the prisoners, of course, but they did me something of a favor. In those 400 days, I was able to write 4,000 pages of manuscript, partly memoirs and partly my Heinrich Himmler biography. So in a way, my enemies did me a favor, because as you come up towards the amber lights in your life, you do tend to slow down and take things a little bit easier. And for those 400 days, I didn't take things easy. I was up and I was writing all day. Thank you, Austria. That's all I can say.
Okay, just leave me and David just to explain what this
Right,
is.
this is David Irving and the Holocaust. The Holocaust and David Irving.
Okay.
Right, a minefield. Right.
Just don't cover your mic with your hand, because that makes us a little bit muffly when you...
Okay,
that's
right,
it.
okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
I want to talk about the Holocaust. That is to say, I don't want to talk about the Holocaust because it's a minefield. Historians, I suppose, when they see David Irving getting involved in the Holocaust, they say, yeah, go for it. I'm interested to hear what you say. And then they pull back to the perimeter, they pull back to the horizon, and they get out their binoculars and have a look to see, they wait for you to go bang. I haven't gone bang yet, because I've been pretty careful about what I say. People say, oh, David Irving's pulled back. David Irving's retracted. David Irving's revised his views. I haven't. Within a narrow band, I don't think I've changed my views very much over the years. But I've been very careful in what I say. First of all, I don't like using the word Holocaust. In Greek, the word means sacrifice by fire. It's got a capital H. Where does it come from? Well, it came, in fact, in about 1970. If you go back beyond 1970, before 1970, you won't find the word being used in this context at all. I know this because when I was in prison in Vienna, arrested under their banning law, as a historian should be for writing the truth, I suppose. When I was in prison in Vienna, I managed to persuade the Institute of History in Munich, which holds all my papers, to send me the note of the interview I had with the brother of Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS. Gebhard Himmler was his totally unimportant brother. He had survived the war years. And there he was, living in 1971 in Munich as a retired civil servant. I went to interview him. Unfortunately, I wasn't interested in the Holocaust, as it's called at that time, because I was writing my book about Adolf Hitler. I was more interested in the relationship between his brother Heine and Hitler. Had I known I was going to write a book eventually about Himmler, I would have spent far more time talking to the brother, but he's now dead. What is interesting is at the end of my 4-page handwritten note of my interview with Heinrich Himmler's brother, Gebhard, I realized that although we had talked about the Holocaust, we'd never actually used the word. The word Holocaust is nowhere on those pages. And the reason is quite simple. I think that about 1972, there was a meeting somewhere in New York, Madison Avenue, where the Jewish community leaders got together with all the professionals and said, we want to start marketing this. We want to start making it, bringing it to the national, to the global consciousness, in the same way that you market a product like Tylenol, like headache medicine. How can we do this? And the PR wizards had said, well, let's tell you how you're going to do this. Like any other product, you've got to give it a capital letter. You've got to give it a trade name. You've got to give it a capital letter. You've got to stress how unique it is. No rivals. You've got to have a slogan. Guinness is good for you, that kind of thing. Take courage, whatever. In this case, of course, it's the 6 million. Don't deviate from that slogan, no matter what other stuff comes up. And hey, you're onto a winner. You can make billions, which of course is how things have gone ever since that meeting, which I suppose happened. Because from that day on, the word Holocaust is in the media. It's taken off. It's now exponentially risen until it's gone to infinity. If you go to the Times Index or the index of the New York Times in America, go back before 1970, you won't find the word being used. After 1972, it takes off exponentially. It's been marketed, which means that as a historian, you've got to be extra careful. So you're not being sold a bill of goods, as the Americans say. You're not being taken for a ride. I believed the whole Holocaust story. I'm not going to call it a legend. I'm not going to call it a myth either. I believed the whole Holocaust story until about 1988. If you read the first edition of my Hitler's book, there's Auschwitz in it, as an extermination camp. If you read the latest edition of Hitler's War, you won't find Auschwitz as an extermination camp. Auschwitz is described here as being a brutal slave labor camp with a very high death rate, which is probably a better description of it. It was neither one thing nor the other. And of course, certain people have taken that very much amiss, that I don't go for the whole story. If you don't go for the whole story, you're in deep trouble. Your books are not published in this town again. Not only they're not published, but they're not reviewed. They're not reviewed, they're not sold. I remember my very dear old literary agent, Max Becker, an American, one of the United States' leading literary agents, Max Becker, saying, David, you've got to understand one thing about publishing in the United States. Your problem when you write books like Hitler's War, it isn't the fact that most of the publishing houses in the United States are Jewish, because they are. It isn't the fact that most of the paperback houses, what they call reprint houses, are Jewish, because all big 7 reprint houses in the United States are Jewish. Your problem isn't even the fact that most of the literary editors are Jewish. It isn't even the fact that most of the op-ed writers, the opinion writers in American newspapers are Jewish. Your biggest problem is the fact that most people who buy books in the United States are Jewish. You're writing largely or significantly to a Jewish audience. And as the Germans say, you can't jump over your own shadow. I just mentioned that in advance. You've got a problem when you're writing about the Holocaust. And I hadn't been aware of that problem until I started deviating. And I suppose if I'm guilty of anything, it isn't revisionism, it isn't Holocaust denial, it's what the communists used to call deviationism. I deviate from the conformist line. If you're a conformist historian like Martin Gilbert, you're going to write the conformist line and your book's going to be widely reviewed and published and sold and distributed, and you're going to live a very comfortable life. If you deviate from that line, then hey, you're in for trouble. My deviationism began in April 1988. I was living actually on a beach in Florida. I was in comfort in April 1988 on a beach in Florida. Down south it's very, very warm. Up in Canada it's very, very cold. I mention that because I got a phone call from Canada, from the defense team defending a German Canadian called Ernst Zundel. I was a Hitler historian. I was an expert on the Third Reich. Would I be willing to come to Toronto within the next 1 or 2 days and give evidence in a court of law as an expert on Hitler and the Third Reich? I said, how cold is it? And they said, well, it's below zero, President, about -20. And I looked at the temperature in Key West, where I was in Florida, which was in the high 80s. And I thought, I don't really want to go there. But eventually I relented. And I flew to Canada 2 or 3 days later. They swore I'd be only 1 day. I'd be 1 day and I'd give evidence and I'd catch the next plane back straight to Miami and Florida, down to Key West. In fact, I stayed there, nearly a week. Very unpleasant, very cold. I gave evidence in the courtroom. The judge accepted me as an expert on the Third Reich. And what was interesting was before I went into the witness box, on the day before, defense counsel, the legendary Canadian barrister, Douglas Christie, gave me a ring binder to read. He said, this is the Leuchter report, and I want you to read it because I'm going to ask you questions about it. So I read the Leuchter report for the first time. A film has been made about Fred Leuchter called Mr. Death. Fred Leuchter is an unassuming, unprepossessing American engineer, engineer in quotation marks because he's never formally registered as an engineer, but he's the kind of person I would regard as an engineer. It doesn't matter. He was a man who was the hired consultant, hired by American penitentiaries as a consultant on execution technology. He gave opinions on gas chambers, he gave opinions on electric chairs, he gave opinions on gallows, and he made them conform with health and safety standards, if you can have such a thing as a health and safety standard when you're stepping into a gas chamber. He was the expert. And quite rightly, the defense team for the Ernst Zundel case in Toronto decided to pick an expert in execution technology to give an expert opinion on Nazi gas chambers. And it was a minefield. They'd opened Pandora's box because Fred Leuchter was totally apolitical. He had not the slightest interest in politics. He wasn't an extremist. His most extreme action in life, I think, was opening a paper bag full of potato chips. That was about as extreme as he got. But he warmed to the idea of going to Poland and visiting the campsites. He wanted to see these things for himself. Fred Leuchter flew to Auschwitz in February 1988. 2 months before I saw his report. And he took with him his young bride. And in fact, the visit to the Auschwitz concentration camp ruins was their honeymoon, which shows how unusual he was. And for the next 2 or 3 days after his arrival in the Auschwitz site near Krakow in Poland, Fred Leuchter burrowed around in that rather gloomy and sinister environment with a bucket and spade, and took 38 samples, I think it was 38, it may have been 37 samples, out of the brickwork, out of the fabric of those gas chambers in Auschwitz, which are shown to the tourists. It was, I suppose, a blasphemous thing to do. It was heresy. It was treading on graves. Not the kind of thing that a nice guy would do. But he brought back those 38 samples wrapped in vinyl plastic bags, and from that point on he had nothing more to do with it. He sent them, or the defense team sent them, to a reliable professional laboratory in Cornell University in New England, in Ithaca. And it was the job of this laboratory to carry out the tests and to examine these samples of the brickwork and mortar and cement to see if there was any trace of hydrogen cyanide poison in the remains. Now you might think, hey, 50 years have passed, or in that time it was 40 years have passed, 45 years have passed, you're not going to find anything, are you? It's been washed out by the wind and rain. Well, the answer is yes, you will find something, because hydrogen cyanide, when it comes in contact with brickwork, the iron content in brick, forms a very, very permanent compound indeed, ferric ferrocyanide, otherwise known as Prussian blue. It's so permanent, it's a dyestuff, a blue dyestuff. And if you go to Auschwitz and have a look at the building, which was acknowledged by all sides as being the fumigation chamber for fumigating clothing, you can see the blue poison gas has seeped out of the fumigation chamber through the cracks in the brickwork and has stained the outside of the building this solid dark blue color. So you do expect to find it after 40, 45 years. The problem was the laboratory that carried out the tests on these 38 samples found no significant trace of cyanide in the so-called homicidal gas chambers at all. Allegedly 1 million people had been gassed in these buildings, and yet there was no trace of the cyanide in them. So imagine me, a student of Imperial College of Science in London. I'd studied enough quantitative and qualitative chemistry to know that you can get to within 6 decimal points a good, it's an exact science, let's put it like that. Unlike writing history, chemistry is an exact science. If a laboratory says there's no trace, then there's no trace. They said they found significant traces of cyanide in the brickwork taken from the fumigation chamber, the blue walls, nothing at all of any significance in the so-called homicidal gas chambers. For me, that was a tilting point. I was no longer conformist. I became a deviationist, a revisionist, a real historian. I stuck my neck out. I wasn't questioned on this in the witness box because the judge in the Ernst Zundel case in Toronto decided not to allow the Leuchter report as evidence, because Leuchter was not a qualified toxicologist and all the things that a court would want. But the Leuchter report has been out there ever since. It is a significant document, and you can see how significant it is from the fact that the enemy, the conformist historians and the Jewish community, went to extraordinary lengths to smear Fred Leuchter from that moment on. This poor, inoffensive young man with a receding forehead and a receding chin, the man who had taken no interest at all in politics, was cast out onto the scrap heap. He ended up selling matches on street corners. He ended up in fear of his life. his name vilified around the world by the very powerful organizations with a vested interest in perpetuating the Holocaust history. I, for my part, was a man they could not so easily dismiss, because I didn't come from nowhere and go to nowhere in the way that Fred Leuchter did, to use the words of the film, Mr. Death. I came with a reputation as an historian. I had 30 solid books behind me, very widely reviewed and well reviewed by the world's press. So they couldn't dismiss me so easily when I said in the witness box, as I did, that I'd seen no evidence that Adolf Hitler had ordered the gassing or liquidation of the world's Jews, Germany's Jews, Europe's Jews. So they had to use a different tack with me. They attacked my publishers, they attacked the newspapers who supported me, and so on. But the Fred Leuchter report was, I think, the solid ground on which I based my skepticism. And I'm quite happy to say that I think Fred Leuchter did a good job. The fact that he's not an engineer is neither here nor there. What kind of engineering skill did you need to scrape these samples out of the brickwork of that building? He brought them back to the United States and he did the tests. And the tests were carried out by qualified forensic chemists. So that's what we know about Fred Leuchter. What do we know about those buildings? Well, if you go to Auschwitz now, the first thing you notice is it is marketed. It's marketed in the way, I suppose I could be quite tasteless and say it's marketed in the way that Disney markets Disneyland. There's a hot dog stand in the car park, which should tell you something about the buildings you're going to be visiting. They're built in the war years and pre-war years for the Nazi purposes, but now they are being preserved for the purpose purely of making money. They are a tourist attraction. They show you a gas chamber in the Auschwitz camp, which is as genuine as the fairy castle is in Disneyland. In fact, it was built after the war, built 3 years after the war was over, in 1948. If you go there now, thanks to us, the deviationists, the revisionists, the real historians, you'll find that the Polish authorities have now finally been forced to put in an inscription outside the gas chamber which says, oh, by the way, in very small print, by the way, this building was erected in 1948 as a replica. Well, you can call it a replica, I call it a fake. If I give you a replica $20 bill, it's a fake $20 bill, and no one's going to be tricked into using it without breaking the law. But this building is a fake. When I found out it was a fake built in 1948, back 1988, 1989, I started saying so quite loudly. I suppose in retrospect I should regret it. Being a qualified and competent speaker, there's no point just saying it's a fake. You then have to embed the sentence in memorable phrase. I remember the phrase I used to use going around Canada and speaking was, the building they showed the tourists in Auschwitz is a fake, built in 1948. More people died, more women died on the back seat of Senator Edward Kennedy's car at Chappaquiddick than ever died in that building. Very tasteless, but you've got to be tasteless to make a point. And the point was remembered and well taken. And my opponents have never forgiven me for making the point so well. How many people did actually die in Auschwitz? It's a very interesting question. The figure is ballooned. And it's rather like the similar question, how many Russians died in World War II? You ask any German now, they say, oh, 20 million. Was it? Some people would say 40 million Russians died in World War II. Because President Weizsäcker said 40 million Russians died in World War II. But the usual figure is 20 million. The actual figure is less than 5 million. How do we know that? Well, if you go to the British archives, there's the private record taken by the interpreter of a meeting between Joseph Stalin, the Russian dictator, and Winston Churchill on July the 19th, 1945, when they met in Potsdam. And they're talking in private over dinner about who should get what in the dismemberment of Germany. And each side is boasting about the damages they suffered. And Stalin says to Churchill, we're entitled to far more, because you've got to realize that we lost in the Soviet Union many, many lives. Nearly 5 million Russians are dead or missing. He would have had no reason to minimize the figure. He would have had every reason to exaggerate the figure. And he said 5 million. But you see how it's ballooned since then. 5 million to 20 million to 40 million. And it's exactly the same with the Holocaust figures. How many died in the Holocaust? I hate that word, Holocaust. You're falling for their salesmanship when you use the word. Well, the answer is a lot. How many died in Auschwitz? I think the best figure you can get as an estimate for Auschwitz is the figure given by the Polish authorities. The Poles you see in Krakow in 1947 put on trial all the Auschwitz top top dogs, all the top brass of Auschwitz. Rudolf Höss, the commandant, Aumeier, his deputy, Liebehenschel, the successor of Rudolf Höss, and the rest. 22 of them were put on trial in Krakow. A lot of them were sentenced to death, and there is a video showing the actual judgment being handed down on them. The judgment was handed down, and in the judgment it says these people who are guilty today had been the principal officers of a camp, Auschwitz, in which up to 300,000 people of all nationalities met their deaths, came to an end. It doesn't say they were killed, it doesn't say they were gassed, it just says they died. Up to 300,000. Now these, you've got to realize, this was the Polish courtroom which had all the Auschwitz documents and all the Auschwitz prisoners to interrogate. And the figure they used in their judgment as they sentenced these men to death was up to 300,000. So how suddenly did the figure balloon to 4 million on the memorial in Auschwitz in the 1970s and 1980s? The communist director, the Jewish director of the Auschwitz State Museum, František Pieper, he eventually had that figure chiseled down and a new monument erected to the 1.2 million killed. You know, it's rather like Monopoly, the Monopoly money, the way they play around with these figures. I'm sorry for any individual innocent person who is killed in war or out of war. That is the real crime in my mind. The real crime really isn't genocide, which is this invented word used by our opponents. The real crime is what I call innocenticide, the killing of innocent people. The crime, it's a crime because the victims are innocent, not because they were Jewish innocent people. You see the difference? Because, but once you start talking about innocent people being killed being the crime, the disadvantage for our opponents is that then suddenly all the global sympathy and treasure, the money, becomes entitled to a larger number of people who are not Jews. The victims of Hiroshima, the bombing victims of Coventry or Dresden, they could start out. The Australians who suffered in the Japanese prison camps, they could start claiming compensation. And so they don't talk about the innocent people being the victims, they talk about genocide, people who are killed by virtue of race. And that's not the real crime in my mind. So in Auschwitz, probably up to 300,000 people died. And I think that's a reasonable figure from the papers that I've read. And you notice the word died. What did they die from? This could be quite plain. Some were gassed. Aumeier, who was the deputy commandant of Auschwitz for nearly a year, 1942, 1943. He was taken prisoner by the British in Norway at the end of the war, and he was questioned extensively. And he was invited to sit down with a pencil in hand and write down all that he knew. None of the famous Holocaust historians bothered to look at Aumeier's writings, his manuscripts. I found them myself in 1992 in the British Public Record Office. Nobody had bothered to look there. I immediately tipped off Robert Jan van Pelt, who is the world's global most famous Holocaust historian. I tipped off Deborah Lipstadt, I tipped off Martin Gilbert, I tipped off all the Holocaust historians and said I found the private papers of Aumeier, the deputy commandant of Auschwitz, including all his manuscript memoirs of life in Auschwitz and what he did as commandant. They never bothered to go and have a look. Doesn't that tell us something about the quality of these so-called historians? So what does Aumeier tell us? He tells us that when the trainloads began arriving in mid-1942 from all over Europe, Jews deported to Auschwitz as slave labor, he found a lot of the Jews couldn't be used. They were medically unfit. They were too old, too frail, too decrepit. He said, when these trainloads arrived, we selected those who were too frail to work, and we took them around the back and disposed of them in 2 houses. 2 little cottages, one called the White House and one called the Red House. You go to Auschwitz now as a tourist and ask the guides to show you the remains of the Red House and the White House. They will very reluctantly, and I stress the word reluctantly, take you to have a look. But you really got to lean on them because they don't want you to see these. They want to take you to the huge crematoria buildings that they say are the gas chambers, the ones that Fred Leuchter examined and found no trace of cyanide in. Because you start coming up against logistics problems when you look at the remains of the little cottages. First of all, one cottage has nothing to be seen. The whole site's been grassed over. The other site, you can actually see the layout. You can see the foundations of the White House. The White House consists of 2 big rooms, about the size of this study here. And in that White House, Aumeier, the deputy commandant, says we could sometimes put as many as 200 people and we gassed them. From his writings, it doesn't appear to have been a very frequent operation. He says it was just from now and again when trainloads came and they had unusable Jews aboard. So these gassings did occur. If you accept that these papers aren't fake, and I don't believe for a moment they are fake, the gassings did occur in Auschwitz, but on nothing like the scale, which is part of the legend now. The mass marketing scale that was designed in that Madison Avenue meeting back in the early 1970s. It's got to be unique, it's got to be bigger than anybody else's, and then you can make billions out of it. So is David Irving a Holocaust denier? I don't think so, because we now start looking totally elsewhere in Poland. We're looking no longer in Auschwitz, at this Disneyland site in southern Poland. We're looking in eastern Poland, along the River Bug. In eastern Poland, there are 3 or 4 sites which you can collectively describe either as the Bug River camps or as the Operation Reinhard camps. Some of the conformist historians say, oh yes, the Reinhard camps were named after Reinhard Heydrich, who was assassinated in May 1942. It's not. They were named after a civil servant called Fritz Reinhard. And he spells his name with a T at the end, H-A-R-D-T. Fritz Reinhard was a civil servant, a state secretary in the finance ministry in Germany, and that gives you a clue as to what the operation was. It was a thieving operation, a looting operation. The Jews were being sent to these camps, and before they were being liquidated, they were being robbed of everything they had. It was a plundering operation. And here is where I say I had to cross swords with the main revisionist body. They don't want to believe the Reinhard camps exist. I think the Reinhard camps did exist. And I'm going to set out here very briefly the evidence for the Reinhard camps having existed. I'll tell you the names first. There was Delzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. And on top of that came the camp called Majdanek. You can go and visit all these camps in Poland now, but the reason they're not on the tourist route is because there's nothing to see. There's no buildings you can see, no execution walls, no buildings described as crematoria or gas chambers. There's just bald patches in the middle of a forest in each place. And to me that is far more evocative, far more lonely and sinister when you go into the middle of this forest and suddenly there's a 1 or 2 kilometer square bald patch where nothing seems to have happened. Until you find, for example, at Treblinka, there's a letter in the private papers of Heinrich Himmler who says, when the operation in Treblinka is finished, I want the whole site demolished and removed, nothing must remain. I want the whole site grassed over and a farmhouse, a farmstead built there in its place, which can be given to some Ukrainian to run. If you really know how to look at the private papers of Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS, you begin stumbling across documents that have been clearly written as part of a cover-up. September 1942, he writes a letter to the chief of the Gestapo saying there's this very disturbing report in the London Daily Telegraph which has come into my hands, which says that the Jews are dying like flies in our camps. I want you to investigate this and find out just what is going on. And you look at that document and you think, what is going on? Well, then you realize something that Hugh Trevor Roper, the famous British historian, told me many years ago in the 1960s. He said, David, when you look at a new document, ask yourself 3 questions. Is it genuine? Who wrote it? Is it written by somebody who is in a position to know? And thirdly, why does this document exist? And I know what he means. The Germans were in a habit of writing what they call Deckungsschreiben, cover-up letters. Letters that would exonerate them in the case that things went wrong, alibis. And that letter from Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the Gestapo, Heinrich Müller, the letter from Himmler to Müller, is a cover-up letter. I want you to find out what's going on. So I'm told the Jews are dying like flies. And then in the autumn of 1944, he writes to Dr. Grawitz, who is one of the head doctors of the SS, chief of the SS, chief surgeon of the SS. And he says, Dr. Grawitz, a fascinating report you've written on the incidence of illnesses in the concentration camps. He says, one very odd thing strikes me. This is Himmler to Grawitz. One very odd thing strikes me. He says, there appears to be nobody dying of cancer in the concentration camps. Can you explain this? Is there some statistical reason for this? Can it be that we have inadvertently stumbled across a cure for cancer? Oh ho, it's a little private joke between the two of them. They know what's happening, why people aren't dying of cancer in the concentration camps. It's the same reason that people don't die of heart disease in France, because they've died of cirrhosis of the liver. It's a statistical anomaly. In the concentration camps, they've died for a totally different reason. So you begin looking at Himmler documents and wondering to yourself, is this a genuine document or not? And then when you travel around the world as I have, you come across documents for which there's no other explanation. They are genuine. In the Hoover archives at Stanford University in California, where they have part of Himmler's private papers, I came across 2 documents that have been sent to him. They are reports on the loot which has been yielded by Operation Reinhard. Operation Reinhard, the operations in the Bug River camps. And it makes very grisly reading. The 2 documents list all the watches and fountain pens and gold coins and everything that have been taken off the people passing through Operation Reinhard. And you've got the report for 1942 and you've got the report for 1943. Very interesting because it gives you a pretty clear idea of people who no longer need their wristwatches and fountain pens and gold coins. Something is happening to them and all the valuables are being channeled back to Berlin for reprocessing and furbishing and overhauling and being put back on the market as part of a major systematic industrialized looting operation. What is significant about these figures is, as I mentioned, you've got the figures for 1942 and you've got the figures for 1943. Now for 1942 we've got a totally different set of figures in a document that I'm going to call the Höfler document. In January 1943, at the end of that year, Höfler, who is a police officer in Lublin, writes a report to Berlin saying the proceeds of the operations in 1942 are as follows. And he gives the most incredible breakdown of operations in 3 camps, which he identifies as T, S, and B. And he gives the total figure for the numbers we processed in each of those camps, and the overall figure for all these camps together up to the last day of 1942 is 1.24 million Jews. Now, the Höfler document, of course, is very significant. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to guess that T, S, and B are Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec, 3 of these camps. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to guess what is happening to them in those camps. They're not being processed through them, they're being dealt with in them. So you've got a figure for 1942 of 1.24 million. But remember, we've also got the corresponding figure of the loot taken off them for 1942. We don't have a processing figure for 1943, but we do have the loot figure for 1943, and so you can probably extrapolate to a reasonable kind of ballpark figure for 1943 too, and say it's probably another million. So suddenly, for those 2 years, Operation Reinhard has generated 2.2 million people or more. Now for a revisionist, this is difficult stuff to swallow. And you're going to have to go back to the Höfler document and ask yourself the all-important question that Trevor Roper said. Question 1, is it genuine or not? Well, you can go to the Public Record Office in London, as I still call it, and you can look at the actual document. It was decoded by the British a few days later. We intercepted the wireless transmission. The Germans, for some reason, sent these messages by radio and not by landline. We intercepted it. We decoded it, and it's in the British files. It's found there by a couple of independent amateur British historians. Steve Tyas is one of them, and he deserves credit for finding this and making it available. The difficulty is that the document contains anomalies. First of all, let me say that I'm 80% sure the document is genuine, the Höfler document. But there's a 20% nagging residual doubt. The document contains anomalies. First of all, it and the corresponding document that goes with it are addressed to Adolf Eichmann. Now, Adolf Eichmann is the big name. And one thing I spotted about fake documents, like the Kujau documents, the Adolf Hitler documents, and so on, is that they tend to be documents written about big names or by big names or to big names, because that's the kind of document that document collectors pay big money for. So that's a big name document. The next thing is the wording contained in the document does not conform with German civil service standards, which were very strictly adhered to. It just says, referring to your message, the answer is as follows. German civil service would require that document to say, referring to your message, register number so-and-so 12345, dated January the 10th, 1943, the answer is as follows. But there is neither a register number or a date in the document. Also, the document has got the highest possible security classification, Geheime Reichssache, and is only one of 3 documents in all the hundreds of thousands of decodes that I've read that has that top secret classification. So we got those minor problems dealing with. Another very slightly lesser problem is that the totals don't add up. There's a digit wrong. So you've got a slightly awkward problem. Then you're left with the nagging suspicion that is it a coincidence that that 7-digit figure it gives as the grand total is identical to the grand total given in a document called the Korher document. Richard Korher, Heinrich Himmler's chief statistician, at the same time ordered to draw up an overall 10-year report on the final solution of the Jewish problem. He sits down and he writes a report in which he says what has happened to all the Jews ever since the Nazis came to power. There were 17 million Jews in the world, 10 million of them in Europe, he says. Of these 10 million, there are still about 4 million left here. The rest have emigrated or of natural wastage. The older ones are stayed behind and died. The younger emigrated and so on. And then he goes on to say 1.24 million Jews, however, were sent to the camps in occupied Poland, where they have been subjected to special treatment. Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to guess what that word means. And Himmler didn't like it. Himmler wrote back to Korher, the statistician at the time, and I was the one who found these letters. And Himmler says, Dr. Korher, excellent report, well written, a bit too long though. You've got to remember, this report's going to be shown to Adolf Hitler, the Führer. I want you to write a short version. Oh, and that sentence where you say the 1.24 million were subjected to special treatment. I want you to reword that. The 1.24 million was sent through camps in occupied Poland to the east. Somebody's having the wool pulled over their eyes. But the significant thing is that figure is identical to the one in the Höfler document. Bit of a coincidence. Was the Höfler document based on the Korher document, perhaps? Was the Korher document based on the Höfler document? Is one or the other a fake? The Korher document, incidentally, makes no mention of Auschwitz. Here he is a statistician writing what happened to all the Jews, and yet Auschwitz doesn't actually figure. Well, if 4 million Jews are supposed to have died there or been killed there in gas chambers, that's a rather significant omission. If you really do your homework as a historian, you're left with these awkward problems. So what do I, as a real historian, after 30 or 40 years' work, fearlessly believe at this stage? I believe the gassings did take place, but the whole thing was an ad hoc operation in these various camps, designed and devised by the local commanders, except for the 3 Reinhardt camps, which were built as extermination centers. No denying that. And it's a pity that the Jewish communities around the world have concentrated or latched onto Auschwitz as their Disneyland, because the real operations were done further east. Not much money to be made there, difficult to get to, and nothing to show the tourists, unless they're tourists who are romantic and can hear the sigh of the deceased and departed in the wind that blows through the pine forests. I'm not a romantic person. I like to see the documents. I like to see the evidence. I can't be intimidated, either by publishers or by newspapers or by journalists or by thugs with baseball bats. They've tried everything. And I still write what I find in the archives. But I do get good luck. 1991, about 3 years after I first saw the Leuchter report, I went to Buenos Aires to speak to audiences in Buenos Aires, in Spanish, of course. And at the end of one of these meetings, a man came up to me with a brown paper parcel, and he handed it to me. He said, "Mr. Irving, I think you're the right person to have these." He is a man of Flemish origin. He lived in Buenos Aires, and he was close to a friend of Adolf Eichmann. Adolf Eichmann had been captured in Buenos Aires in 1960 by the Israeli commandos and taken to Israel and put on trial and hanged. I think he was a small cog, frankly. I don't think he was a very important man. But his family, worried that these Israeli commandos would raid his house next because he was kidnapped in the street, decided overnight to put all his private papers in the hands of a friend of the family. This friend of the family gave them to my man in Buenos Aires, who now handed this brown paper parcel to me. I took it back to England, and a few weeks passed before I actually opened it and began reading what Eichmann had been writing. He had begun at about 1956, in captivity, writing his own memoirs, putting things down on paper, getting things straight in his own mind. He knew that there was an international hue and cry now. And he began writing his own memoirs down, repeating himself many, many times over. You can see the tendency to alibi beginning in it. More than once he says, I remember back in 1941 when Reinhard Heydrich, the chief of the the Reich Homeland Security Agency, as I would say, Reinhard Heydrich came to me and said that Himmler has told me that the Führer has reached the decision that the Jews have to be physically annihilated. People point that to me and say, there you are, David. That's the evidence. You're wrong. Hitler was involved. I don't think so. I got evidence there only of Adolf Eichmann being involved, and of Adolf Eichmann sitting down in the 1950s realizing that the day is going to come when he does have his day in court, and the only thing that will get him off the hook is if he says I was carrying out Hitler's orders. That's the way the human mind works. I'm not saying he consciously did it. It's more likely that Heydrich came to him one day and said, the Führer, Adolf Hitler, has ordered, he wants the Jews all out of Europe. And from that had then developed the more radical version. Clearly, if such an order existed, you would expect to find it on paper. You would expect the British to have decoded it somewhere. You would expect somebody to have written a letter home to their mother saying, dear mummy, I have today had to transmit the most terrible order to the SS Gruppenführers on the Eastern Front. This kind of thing. And after 60 years, we're entitled to expect such an order to come. As you probably know, ever since my book on Adolf Hitler, Hitler's War, was published in 1977, for 42 years, now 32 years now, I've offered a £1,000 reward for anybody who can find one wartime document showing that Adolf Hitler even knew about Auschwitz, let alone gave orders for the killing of the Jews. The only documents you gradually find run the other way. We find that on the day that Auschwitz was overrun by the Russian army, the Red Army, in January 1945, the chief of the German General Staff, General Guderian, comes to Hitler and says at the war conference, which is written down by shorthand writers, yesterday the Red Army overran Auschwitz, mein Führer. And Hitler, a few seconds later, saying, well, what does he say? Does he say, oh my God, I hope we manage to destroy everything before the Russians find it, so they've got no trace of what we've been up to? No, he just says, okay, jawohl, means nothing to him. It's the same, if you look at all the documents, if you follow the methods that I used when I wrote my Hitler biography, I picked only genuine documents, ones that I was pretty satisfied that were genuine. At that time, we didn't have any of the decodes, of course. I picked documents that had been on Hitler's desk, documents of which he was aware. I had a pretty strict criterion I applied, and you get a very different picture then. You get a picture then of Adolf Hitler putting out his hand and protecting the Jews every time there was any risk of any harm being done to them. It's a very unusual picture. And for a long time, I was way out alone on a short plank. In my opinion, that Adolf Hitler was not an anti-Semite during the war years, but I'm glad to see now that an Austrian professor, who's probably risking her own liberty in saying this, a professor at the University of Vienna, Brigitte Hamann, has published a book called Hitler in Vienna, in which she comes to exactly the same opinion, that during World War II, after he came to power, Adolf Hitler was not an anti-Semite, not anti-Jewish. Okay, he made these speeches. I've got them on the wall here. There. Eine der größten Reden Adolf Hitler, one of the most famous speeches of Adolf Hitler, a prophetic warning to the world's Jews, prophetische Warnung an das Judentum. This is the famous speech of January the 30th, 1939. I've had it on my wall ever since Henrietta von Schirach gave me these copies of the Nazi newspaper. But if you open that page, you take it out of its frame, and you open the newspaper up, you find the actual speech is 6 pages long, and the reference to the Jews is only 3 or 4 lines long. That's what his interest was. But it was the Nazis who were with him, Rosenberg and Bormann and Himmler and the others, Adolf Eichmann, from the top dogs down to the junior ones. They were the ones who wanted to carry out the campaign to its murderous conclusion. Adolf Hitler was more interested in winning the war. We got episodes of this throughout the war years. A famous episode, November the 30th, 1941. He found out that a trainload of Jews was leaving Berlin and heading to Riga on the Eastern Territories, newly occupied. And Himmler came to him and said, why don't we just liquidate them? We can't house them. And Hitler says, that out of the question. And Himmler had to telephone Heydrich. We got his own handwritten telephone notes saying, keine Liquidierung, not to be liquidated. And it was too late. They were already dead. They were already lying face down, dead, sardine fashion in pits, all machine gunned to death, 1,000 Berlin Jews that morning in the pits outside Riga, along with 4,000 local Jews from Riga who had been swept up in a liquidation action by SS Gruppenführer Jeckeln, who was the chief of the SS and police in Riga on that day. And the interesting thing now is that we have the intercepted messages that passed between Himmler and Jeckeln that very day. That morning, Jeckeln sends him a message which we intercepted and decoded, saying, Herr Reichsführer, can you get for me 12 more of those fantastic Finnish-made Tommy guns, the ones with the drum magazines, because they're ideal for our Sonderaktionen, our special operations, meaning the killing operations. You know, like James Cagney, you know, in the movies, the Tommy guns with the drum magazines. And the Suomi magazine Tommy gun was ideal for the killing operations. And Jeckeln sends his message to Himmler. The message which Jekon gets back that evening is anything but what he expected. Himmler says, the operation you carried out in Riga grossly violates the guidelines laid down by me and Heydrich. Any such further excesses will be ruthlessly punished. You are to report to headquarters. He's referring to the killing of the Berlin Jews and the local Jews. It's not the picture you get, you see, when you read the books by Martin Gilbert and the others. Something is going wrong. Something is very haphazard on the Eastern Front. And later that evening, a few minutes later, Grothmann, Himmler's chief adjutant, sends a message to the same SS general at Riga saying, you are to inform us how you are arriving so we can have you met. And from Himmler's diary we see that Jekon came to see him on December the 4th. And they had supper together and talked about Judenfrage, the Jewish problem. That's real history. That's what I call real history. And you get the image that something is going wrong. Something is not wanted by Hitler's headquarters. In fact, on that very day, November the 30th, there's a German army colonel who hears what's happening to the Jews outside the town. And he's lost all his Jews that day, and he's wondering where his Jewish workers have gone. And the local SS guy says, well, if you want to know what's happening to your Jewish friends, you better drive out town, down the road to Dunaburg, to Dvinsk, about 8 kilometers, and you'll see what's happening to your lovely Jews. And the colonel, he describes in April 1945 to a prisoner in a British prison camp, near here, in Latimer. And he says, so I drove down the road, and there was this open field, and 2 or 3 pits had been dug out, and truckloads of Jews were being driven up and made to lie down in the pits, sardine fashion, and they were being machine gunned to death by these men standing on the rim. And a fellow prisoner says, but Herr General, because he's a general now, Herr General, what were the gunners saying? Were they saying anything when they were doing this? Oh yes, all these coarse remarks, these coarse shouts were going. I remember one of them shouting, look at that one, look at that beauty. And I can see her in my mind's eye now, a beautiful girl in a flame-red dress. And that's that day, November the 30th, 1941. And he says, we discussed it among ourselves, army officers. Somebody had to tell the Führer, Adolf Hitler, what was going on. None of us wanted to be the one. So we sent for a lieutenant and told him to come out later that day, see what was going on and write a report. And we sent his report up to Hitler's headquarters. And that evening the order came that this kind of shooting had to stop immediately, forthwith, from Hitler's headquarters. You won't find that in the books by Martin Gilbert either, because they can't fit it in. They can't fit any of these documents in. In the spring of 1942, after the Wannsee Conference, where they discussed the logistics, the transportation movements of Hitler's order that all the Jews had to be thrown out of Germany and shipped to the east. This was Hitler's order, quite without question. In January the 20th, 1942, this conference had taken place at Wannsee. And a month later, another conference took place, and the report on that was circulated among the ministers. And you can see a reference to it in Goebbels' diary. He says, well, obviously not much is going to remain of the Jews when all this operation's over, he says. You can say that probably 80% of them are going to be wiped out and 20% will be put to work. That's what he writes in his diary. But a number of other ministers are very worried about that. The Minister of Justice, Schlegelberger, who's standing in for Gürtner, who died, Schlegelberger writes a memorandum, a letter to the Chief of the Civil Service, Dr. Lammers, and he says, what's going on here? He says, I can see that if we go on down this particular road, the Führer Adolf Hitler may find himself stampeded into decisions that we'll later regret. Lammers writes back to him saying, I think you're right. I'll come to Berlin at the end of this month, March 1942, and we'll have to talk about it, you and me. We got these letters. These letters actually exist. And Lammers came to see Schlegelberger, the Minister of Justice, who's a lawyer, of course. And the lawyer Schlegelberger sits down and he writes a memorandum, which I can quote you verbatim because I've read it so often, in German. Reichsminister Dr. Lammers, teilt mir mit. Reichsminister Dr. Lammers has informed me that the Führer, that's Adolf Hitler, has repeatedly ordained that he wants the solution of the Jewish problem postponed until after the war is over. We got that actual memorandum. It vanished in Nuremberg. You couldn't find it because the American lawyers in Nuremberg, I know who it was, actually destroyed the negative photocopy they'd made. It vanished from the file because they can't use a document like that, showing Hitler saying nothing must happen, I want everything left until the war's over. Typical Hitler, a procrastinator, but also he wanted to win the war first. He said, let's win this war first. We're in difficulty on the Eastern Front. We don't need all your problems. Let's win the war first, and then we can deal with the churches and the Jews and all the other little subsidiary problems that are fascinating and obsessing you guys. Typical Hitler. But the Holocaust historians like Longerich or Martin Gilbert or Robert Jan van Pelt, to them this is a square document and they can't ram it into their own round Holocaust hole. And so what do? They toss it under the table and hope nobody will find it. And along comes this dreadful David Irving and found the document and says, how do you explain this then? How do you square this with your theories? Arrest that man, he's a fascist, he's a Holocaust denier. Ruin him, smash him. And that was their answer, of course. But the document is still there in the archives. We found the actual document now. It's in the German government archives. Hitler ordering the solution to the Jewish problem, the Holocaust, whatever the others were asking for. Hold it off, fellas, until this war is finished. It's there in black and white. Written by a lawyer. Lawyers know how to write documents. They write very, very precise. I'm going to bore you by staying with this document for a minute or two. All the rest is pure guff. Longerich and the other historians who waffled on about Hitler and the final solution and Himmler, they come up with their theories and then admit, well, I've got no documents that support my theories. But here I come to them with a document, a wartime document, a genuine document, written by somebody who knows, written by the chief of the Ministry of Justice, based on a conversation with the head of the civil service who's been close to Hitler. They're talking about Hitler, they're talking about the final solution to the Jewish problem, they're talking about dates and decisions, and yet you won't find this document mentioned in a single book written by these conformist historians. It reminds me of another document, The Night of Broken Glass, 1938. When Goebbels, the evil genius behind Hitler's bench, Goebbels has ordered all the synagogues burned down and attacked, and all the Jews rounded up and harassed and molested and terrorized, because a German diplomat has been assassinated by a Jewish lunatic in Paris. Goebbels had ordered this outrage during the night, this pogrom, as the Russians would have called it, and Hitler is totally in the dark. Hitler's private staff, they said to me, Herr Irving, we were with the Führer, the chief, Adolf Hitler, that night in Munich. We were in our apartment beneath his. We got word from the hotel, the Prinzregentenstrasse, the Four Seasons Hotel, to come immediately and get our baggage because a synagogue was on fire next door to the hotel, risking the hotel. And we went upstairs and told the chief. And Hitler said, what's going on then? Find out. And he sent for Goebbels, and he sent for Himmler, the chief of the SS. And he was furious, he was livid with rage. And all night long he orders Goebbels and the others to issue orders to stop this madness. And in the archives I found one of these orders, signed by the office of Hitler's deputy, Rudolf Hess, sent out by his office. 10 o'clock, 10th of November 1938, sent out at 2:58 in the morning, nearly 3 a.m. Again, it's only 2 or 3 lines long. It says, on orders from the very highest level. If you're the deputy to Hitler and you say this is orders from the highest level, this is the guy above you, Adolf Hitler himself. On orders from the very highest level, there are to be no acts of arson or outrages against Jewish property on any circumstances, under any circumstances whatsoever. And I remember reading this to an audience in the University of Bonn many, many years ago. 400 students packed into the auditorium maximum at the University of Bonn. All the academics sitting in the front row, the professors, and all the communists in red sitting in the back, waiting to cause an uproar and a tumult. And I pride myself that I can win an audience in a couple of minutes. And I started off with that document. I read this out to you, and I said, I'm going to read out a document to you that you have never, ever heard of before. And I read out those 2 lines. The Night of Broken Glass. An absolute silence, a total hush fell on the auditorium. And I said, now you're going to have to ask yourselves, ladies and gentlemen, here in the auditorium, why I am coming to you as an English writer and telling you of this document that has existed for 40 years and you have never been told of, although you're studying Third Reich history. There's only 2 possible explanations. Either that your academics sitting here in the front row knew about this document and decided not to tell you about it, or they didn't know about this document and they were ignorant, in which case they don't deserve to be teaching you in the first place. And the auditorium erupted in applause, of course. Now you begin to understand why I'm banned from German soil. Why I've not been invited to speak at universities recently. It's because I come with the harsh facts based on what I find in the archives. I'm not going to bore you with all the other documents, but there's a string, a chain of documents that I put before the court in the Lippstadt trial that show Adolf Hitler trying to stop ugly things happening to the Jews again and again, like that November the 30th, 1941 episode in Riga with the Berlin Jews. In 1943, October 1943, the German diplomat in Rome, which had just been occupied by the Nazis. The German diplomat in Rome sends a message to the German Foreign Ministry saying the SS chief here in Rome has told me that he's received orders to round up the 12,000 Jews in Rome and send them to northern Italy where they are to be liquidated. He uses the word liquidated. You don't have to kind of decode euphemisms, right? And I'm going to have to stop here. What do you say, Jessica? Can you turn off the oven?
Rolling.
And then again, in October 1943, we have exactly the same kind of episode. On October the 4th, 1943, the German diplomat in Rome, which had just been occupied, Italy had just been occupied by the Nazis. The German diplomat in Rome sent a telegram to the foreign ministry in Berlin saying he'd just been told by the SS chief in Rome that he had received orders to round up the 12,000 Jews in Rome and ship them to northern Italy where they were to be liquidated. And he uses the word liquidated. No euphemisms there. Ribbentrop, who is the German foreign ministry, goes to see Hitler that same 2 days later. I know this because I've got the actual visitor, the guest register of Adolf Hitler's headquarters. And that shows Ribbentrop visiting Hitler. And later that day, Ribbentrop sends a message back to the German consul in Rome saying the Führer has ordered that the Jews of Rome are to be sent to Auschwitz and to be kept alive. So here again, Adolf Hitler intervening, saying not to be liquidated, kept alive as hostages, kept as pawns. And you don't find these documents quoted anywhere. I brought this up in the Lipstadt trial, and immediately, of course, the conformist historians, they become contortionist historians. They go into contortions then to try to explain that that document meant everything else but what it actually said on the face of it. I remember questioning the chief expert witness in the Lipstadt trial about the one I mentioned just now, about the Night of Broken Glass. I said, here you've got a two-line document showing quite clearly Hitler intervening on the highest orders to stop the outrages. How do you explain that? He said, oh, I read this document totally differently. I read this as Hitler saying, well, go ahead, fellows, carry on brutalizing and bashing up the Jews and throwing them into concentration camps and murdering them and burning down the synagogues, but watch out for the property that's next door to German property in case you damage the German property. I remember saying to him, Professor Evans, you read all that into those two lines, do you? Heavy sarcasm. Of course, none of it worked, because at the end of the day, the judge just did this in the Lipstadt trial. So you get this picture of not an actually benevolent Adolf Hitler, but a Hitler who couldn't really care about the Jewish problem in the war years. And I'm going to end on the very last moment, of course, of Hitler's life, when he took his own life on April the 30th, 1945. I remember speaking to his secretary, Traudl Junge. Traudl Junge was his youngest and most beautiful secretary, together with Gerda Christian. He sent to Traudl Junge in the bunker just after the wedding to Eva Braun. And Frau Junge said to me, she said, Mr. Irving, after the wedding of Hitler and Eva Braun, who is now Eva Hitler, the chief sent for me and he said, Frau Junge, come into the adjoining room, will you please, and bring your shorthand pad. And no sooner had he closed the door than he immediately began dictating without any notes off the top of his head. And I realized he was dictating his final testament, his last will and testament, his political testament. And halfway down that political testament, you come to a sentence which has baffled historians. From memory, it's roughly, he says, I command my successor, Admiral Dönitz, to carry on the remorseless fight against the Jews, which we have carried on for the last 12 years. Although we have used methods that are far more humane than have the enemy, the Allies, with their ruthless bombing war against German civilians in the German cities. And it's the word humane that baffles people. They say, how can Hitler say what he was doing to the Jews was humane? Well, just possibly he wasn't in the loop. Just possibly Himmler was doing things that Hitler wasn't aware of. And this isn't just a weird theory, because Himmler's chief of staff, General Karl Wolff, he survived after the war a long time because he had dealt with the Allies and he had done a deal with the Allies. He wrote private memoirs, which he deposited in the Institute of History in Munich, on the condition they remained confidential. And for many years they remained confidential, but my historian friends there let me read them. And Wolff says, I remember in August 1942 discussing with Heinrich Himmler, the chief of the SS, and he was particularly depressed and dejected, downcast. And I said, why are you depressed, chief? And Himmler replied, I am doing something of which the Messiah of the coming 2,000 years must never learn. And Karl Wolff goes on to say, I didn't realize what he was talking about at the time, but now, of course, I do. This was right at the height of Operation Reinhard, the killing of the Jews in the Buga camps. And Himmler says, I am doing something of which the Messiah of the coming 2,000 years must never learn. And finally, other historians like Longerich are coming round to my viewpoint that probably Hitler himself was being kept deliberately out of the loop. Longerich writes in his latest Himmler biography, I believe, I've only read the newspaper reviews, he says that if you read the Heinrich Himmler speeches carefully, you see that he's very careful not to claim that he's acting on orders from Hitler. And the language he uses leaves strongly the impression to the historian that in fact he was acting on his own. At one point in a speech in October 1943, Himmler actually says, I know a lot, in a speech to SS generals, he says, I know a lot of you understand why we're killing the Jews, but a lot of you don't quite understand why we're also killing the women and children. And he says, I'm doing this, I have taken this decision myself because it would be wrong to leave generations, our coming generations, to deal with this problem all over again. So again, he could so easily have said, Hitler has taken this decision, or the Führer has taken this decision, but he doesn't. He says, I have taken this decision. And again, in that famous message to General Jekyll at Riga, he says, you've exceeded the guidelines laid down by myself and by the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, by Heinrich. He doesn't say the guidelines laid down by Hitler. So in summary, what do I believe happened? There are two kinds of killing of the Jews. There was the killing of the Jews in camps like Auschwitz, where excess Jews were disposed of because they couldn't be put to work as slave labor on a very small scale, on a comparatively small scale. And there was a systematic mopping up of operations behind the Eastern Front in cities like Riga and Minsk. Minsk was in White Russia. The governor of White Russia was Wilhelm Kuber. Kuber's son lives in Argentina now. His son recently sent me 200 negative photographs from his father's collection. I scanned these in very close detail, and I've enlarged one of the scans. One of the photographs shows just a huge heap of baggage. There's an empty street, a heap of about 200 suitcases and trunks piled up on the sidewalk beside the street. And if you zoom in on the labels on one of the bags, you can see the name begins with Sarah, so it's probably a Jew. This was typical of what happened in Minsk. The Jews were liquidated in Minsk as well. And I think there's no question that the Jews in Minsk and Riga and other cities along the Eastern Front, particularly down the far south, they were rounded up and taken out in the outskirts, out of sight, and liquidated, systematically liquidated as part of the anti-partisan operations, preemptive killing. So this did happen. It happened on a huge scale. I think the Jews have made a big mistake in trying to sweep it all up into one concept, the Holocaust with a capital H, and market that in the same way they would market headache tablets, just to make money. It has, I think, debased the whole of this vast human tragedy. They should be looking really at other issues. They should be asking themselves, can this happen again? Why did it happen in the first place? Why us? They never ask the why us question, because even posing the why us question is considered to be anti-Semitic, the suggestion that they themselves are partly to blame for their own tragedy, the architects of their own misfortune. I think these things should be looked at closely. Nobody would want a tragedy like this to happen on this kind of scale again. The whole German people are now bearing the guilt for the crimes committed by a few people in their name. It may happen again, of course, because it has not been systematically and properly researched. It is wrong that historians who deviate from the official line should be penalized and criminalized and cast into prison for asking awkward questions. The questions remain, and it is for us, the real historians of the world,